Hello guys and welcome back to Boring Historian. Tonight we are delving into a tale so peculiar, so utterly unserious for an emperor, that you might just find yourself chuckling softly, even though, if you were living in ancient Rome under our subjects' reign, that chuckle could land you in quite a pickle. Imagine, if you will, the flickering oil lamps casting long, dancing shadows across cold marble floors. The air is thick with the scent of old parchment and the faint, unsettling aroma of fear mixed with, well, probably a bit of old Roman sewage, let's be honest. You're a citizen, perhaps a humble baker, perhaps a senator with too much toga and not enough patience. You're walking through the forum, and suddenly, a quiet joke escapes your lips. A tiny, involuntary puff of air. But in this Rome, under this particular emperor, even that small release of mirth could be a dangerous, even life-threatening transgression. You'd probably not survive a week without accidentally offending someone by just having a good time. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe it only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And as you settle in, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Our story begins with a name that practically screams Rome. Julius Caesar. Now, you've probably heard of him. Togas, triumphs, a rather unfortunate incident involving a lot of pointy objects on the Ides of March. He's the guy who conquered Gaul, marched on Rome, and ultimately became a figure so dominant, his name became synonymous with emperor for centuries to come. But tonight, we're not going to focus solely on his military genius or his political ambition. Oh no, we're peeling back the layers of power and propaganda to peek into a far more intimate and perhaps even more controversial aspect of his life, his reputation as a prolific lover. You see, while he was busy conquering continents, it seems Caesar was also quite adept at conquering hearts and perhaps bedrooms. Imagine you're a Roman socialite, sipping watered-down wine at a lavish villa party. The air is thick with gossip, and the latest whispers revolve around none other than Gaius Julius Caesar. Is he with Servilia again? Did that scandalous tale about the Queen of Bithynia really happen? You lean in closer, eager for the juicy details. Because in ancient Rome, especially at the pinnacle of power, the private lives of public figures were anything but private. They were currency, weapons, and sometimes even sources of genuine fascination. Caesar, with his undeniable charisma and a flair for the dramatic in all aspects of his life, certainly provided ample fodder for the Roman rumor mill. His reputation as a ladies' man, and indeed a man interested in more than just ladies, was almost as famous as his military victories. It became a part of his public persona, often used by his enemies as a tool for slander, but just as often, perhaps, a source of quiet admiration among those who saw it as another facet of his boundless energy and virility. Historians still argue whether the sheer volume of his alleged affairs was a genuine reflection of his personal habits, or a deliberate exaggeration by both his supporters to show his vigor and his detractors to paint him as morally corrupt. You see, in Rome there was a fine line between being a respected patriarch and a depraved hedonist, and Caesar often danced right on that line with a mischievous grin. You just know that old Senator Cato, with his perpetually grumpy face, probably needed a strong chamomile tea every time Caesar's latest romantic escapade hit the streets. Now to truly understand Caesar's approach to. Well, everything, including his love life, you need to set the scene. Imagine Rome in the 1st century BC. This isn't the Rome of toga parties and polite sips of wine that Hollywood sometimes shows you. This is a sprawling, bustling, often brutal city, the heart of an empire that's growing faster than a teenager's appetite. And its society, it's a fascinating, contradictory beast. On the one hand, there are incredibly strict moral codes, particularly for women, and an almost obsessive focus on pietas, duty to family, state, and gods. On the other hand, for the elite, there's an unspoken understanding that those rules often bent, sometimes to the point of breaking, especially when power and politics were involved. It was a bit like a modern-day reality TV show, but with more chariots and less air conditioning. Marriage in Rome wasn't primarily about romantic love. Bless your sweet modern heart if you thought it was. For the patrician class, it was a strategic alliance, a way to consolidate wealth, forge political connections, and produce legitimate heirs. You might marry someone you barely knew, all because your father and their father decided it was a good business move. Think of it less as a wedding vow and more as a very fancy, extremely complicated merger agreement. Divorce, too, was surprisingly common and relatively easy, especially for men. A simple declaration was often enough, and poof, you were free to find a new political alignment. This fluidity meant that while marriage was important, it wasn't necessarily a lifelong commitment, which, as you might imagine, opened up a few more opportunities for extracurricular activities. And then there were the scandals. Oh, the scandals. Rome thrived on gossip, and while publicly you maintained a stoic facade, privately, the elite were often engaged in all sorts of intriguing affairs. You had married men and women engaging in liaison, sometimes openly, sometimes discreetly, depending on how powerful they were and how much they cared about public opinion. There wasn't Instagram, no Twitter, but the Roman grapevine was probably faster and more vicious than any digital network. Whispers traveled like wildfire through the baths, the forum, and the dinner parties. A quirky tidbit, wealthy Roman matrons sometimes used their enormous dowries to fund their own political networks, sometimes even subtly influencing their husbands' careers, which meant they weren't just pretty faces in a toga, they had their own power bases. You see, the societal norms were a bit like a leaky bucket. They held water. But there were always little drips and trickles of indiscretion finding their way out. For men, especially powerful men, the rules were far more lenient. While overt debauchery might draw criticism, particularly from moralizing figures like Cato the Younger, who, let's be honest, probably disapproved of sunshine and puppies too, a certain level of extramarital activity was almost expected. It was seen by some as a sign of virility, of a man's untamed Roman spirit. As long as it didn't disrupt the political order or led to public disgrace, it was often overlooked. Think of it as the original boys will be boys attitude, but with senators instead of frat brothers. Historians still argue whether this leniency was a symptom of declining Roman morals or a long-standing, unacknowledged aspect of elite Roman life. Either way, it provided the perfect backdrop for someone like Caesar, who seemed to push every boundary he encountered, both on the battlefield and in the bedroom. You can already sense how his life was going to be anything but boring, can't you? Get ready for some serious drama. With that fascinating Roman backdrop firmly in mind, let's rewind to the earliest chapters of Gaius Julius Caesar's life. You might imagine him as a stern, toga-clad figure from birth, but even as a young patrician, Caesar was exhibiting the traits that would define his tumultuous romantic future. Born into one of Rome's oldest and most distinguished families, the Julii, young Caesar was, by all accounts, incredibly handsome, intelligent, and possessed of a magnetic charm that seemed to draw people to him effortlessly. He was the kind of kid who probably never had to pay for a round of drinks, even when he was just starting out. This early charisma, combined with his noble birth, set the stage for a life that would be anything but dull, especially when it came to matters of the heart. His youth was a period of intense political upheaval in Rome, marked by bloody civil wars and rivalries that saw powerful figures like Marius and Sulla clashing for control. This wasn't a stable environment for anyone, let alone an ambitious young man. But it was precisely in this crucible of chaos that Caesar began to hone his skills, not just in rhetoric and military strategy, but also in the art of personal influence and, yes, seduction. He understood instinctively that power in Rome wasn't just about legions. It was about alliances, favors, and knowing how to charm the right people, or perhaps the right person. One of the earliest and most telling anecdotes from his youth, though perhaps apocryphal, involves a scandalous affair with a Vestal virgin named Postumia. Remember those Vestal virgins we talked about? The ones with the sacred fire and the whole, buried alive penalty for breaking their vows of chastity? Yeah, those Vestal virgins. The story goes that Caesar, even as a relatively young man, was accused of impropriety with Postumia. While he was acquitted, the very accusation itself speaks volumes about his early reputation for pushing boundaries. It's a quirky tidbit that reveals how quickly he became associated with daring and controversial liaisons. Historians still argue whether this was a genuine affair or a politically motivated smear tactic by his enemies attempting to discredit him early on. But either way, it certainly got people talking. You see, Caesar was never one to shy away from a challenge, whether it was conquering a barbarian tribe or charming a woman forbidden by ancient Roman law. He understood that scandal, while risky, could also be a form of notoriety, a way to stand out in a crowded field of ambitious young Romans. While other patrician youths might have quietly pursued their discreet dalliances, Caesar seemed to operate with a bolder, more audacious spirit. He wasn't content to merely follow the rules. He seemed to delight in bending or even breaking them, confident in his ability to navigate the fallout. This early willingness to flirt with danger, even in his romantic life, was a powerful precursor to the man he would become, a man who dared to cross the Rubicon, literally and figuratively, in pursuit of his ambitions. It's almost as if his future self, the great conqueror, was already practicing his moves, just on a slightly smaller, more personal scale. Despite the early whispers and youthful indiscretions, Caesar's first marriage was, by Roman standards, quite conventional, at least in its initial purpose. You see, when a young patrician came of age, a marriage was usually arranged, and for Caesar, that woman was Cornelia. She was the daughter of Lucius Cornelius Cinna, a powerful and influential figure in Roman politics, a man who had been a consul and a staunch supporter of Gaius Marius Caesar's uncle by marriage. So, right off the bat, you understand this wasn't some whirlwind romance you'd see in a modern-day rom-com. This was a calculated political alliance, a strategic move to solidify Caesar's connections within a specific faction of Roman society. It was probably more like a corporate merger than a love match, but with more elaborate ceremonies and fewer spreadsheets. They were married around 84 BC, when Caesar was still quite young, likely in his late teens or early 20s. Cornelia herself was probably a mere girl, perhaps 16 or 17. From what we can glean from the sparse historical records, she seems to have been a respectable Roman matron, dedicated to her family and to Caesar. She gave birth to their only child, a daughter named Julia, who would later become a significant figure in Caesar's life and a pawn in his political maneuvering. This early marriage, though politically motivated, provided Caesar with a degree of stability and a legitimate heir, both crucial elements for a rising Roman nobleman. It was the bedrock of his domestic life, even as his public and later private life became increasingly turbulent. However, even a seemingly stable marriage like this couldn't escape the tumultuous political currents of the late Roman Republic. Remember those civil wars we briefly touched on? The ones between Marius and Sulla? Well, Sulla eventually emerged victorious, and he was not a man to forgive and forget. He embarked on a brutal proscription, essentially a hit list of his political enemies, confiscating their property and executing those who refused to comply. Caesar, as Marius's nephew and Cinna's son-in-law, suddenly found himself on the wrong side of history and on Sulla's list. This is where his marriage to Cornelia took an unexpected dramatic turn. Sulla, in his efforts to completely crush the Marian faction, ordered Caesar to divorce Cornelia. It was a test of loyalty, a demand to renounce his politically inconvenient family ties. Most men in Caesar's position would have complied. You simply didn't argue with Sulla when he was in full purge mode. It was like telling a hungry lion to politely use a napkin. But Caesar, even as a young man, displayed an extraordinary stubbornness under remarkable defiance of authority. He refused. This wasn't just about his personal feelings for Cornelia, though we can't rule out genuine affection. More likely, it was a profound act of political resistance, a refusal to be intimidated by the dictator. It was a bold, almost suicidal move that showcased his unwavering resolve. Historians still argue whether this defiance was primarily an act of principle, a calculated gamble to establish his independent spirit, or simply the impetuousness of youth. Either way, it marked him as a man who would not bend easily, even under the direst of threats. This early test of character, rooted in his marriage, laid the groundwork for the colossal clashes of will that would define his entire career. And speaking of danger, what happened next was straight out of a Roman thriller. So there you have it, a young Julius Caesar defying the most powerful man in Rome, Sulla, by refusing to divorce Cornelia. This was not a minor disagreement, mind you. This was an act of extreme insubordination, a direct challenge to the dictator's authority. And it came with very real, very immediate consequences. Sulla, as you can imagine, was not known for his patience or his forgiving nature. His response was swift and brutal. He ordered Caesar to be proscribed, effectively marking him as an enemy of the state, a man whose life and property were forfeit. Imagine that for a moment. You're just starting your adult life, and suddenly, the most powerful person in your country wants you dead. It's enough to make you wish you'd just, bought that villa in the countryside and focused on your olive trees after all. Caesar was forced to flee Rome, becoming a fugitive overnight. This wasn't a leisurely trip to the beach. This was a desperate flight for survival, constantly looking over his shoulder, constantly in fear of being discovered by Sulla's agents or bounty hunters. He moved from hiding place to hiding place, relying on the loyalty of friends and family who dared to defy Sulla themselves. This period of his life, though brief, was incredibly formative. It taught him the brutal realities of Roman politics, the fickle nature of power, and the importance of cultivating unwavering loyalty among his allies. It also hardened him, giving him a first-hand taste of what it meant to be an outlaw, to live on the edge. A quirky tidbit from this period: Sulla reportedly relented on his order after powerful intercessors, including the Vestal Virgins, ironically, perhaps given Caesar's later actions, pleaded on Caesar's behalf. Sulla, with a chillingly prophetic observation, allegedly remarked to them, "You don't know what you are asking. In that young man there are many Mariuses." He saw the potential for greatness, yes, but also for immense trouble, for future challenges to the established order. Historians still argue whether Sulla's eventual pardon was a sign of genuine mercy, a shrewd political calculation to avoid making Caesar a martyr, or simply a temporary distraction as he dealt with other pressing matters. Regardless of the exact motivation, it highlights that even then, Caesar possessed a quality that made people, even powerful dictators, hesitate. So, Caesar narrowly escaped death, his marriage to Cornelia remaining intact. This defiance, born from a confluence of political maneuvering and perhaps genuine personal conviction, allowed him to live to fight another day, both politically and romantically. It showed that he was a man who would stand by his principles, even when it meant facing down the most ruthless figure of his era. This kind of resolute courage, you'll find, was a magnet for many throughout his life, not just on the battlefield. It was a quality that women, and indeed men, often found irresistibly attractive. Think of it as the ultimate bad boy appeal, but with far higher stakes than just a stern talking to from your parents. This experience of peril and survival would no doubt shape his adventurous spirit, propelling him towards even more daring exploits, both in war and, as we'll soon discover, on the high seas. Having narrowly escaped Sulla's prescriptions, you might think young Caesar would have settled down, kept a low profile. But if you've been listening so far, you'll know that's simply not Caesar's style. Instead, he embarked on a journey to Rhodes to study rhetoric, a common pursuit for ambitious young Romans. However, his voyage was dramatically interrupted, cementing his reputation for audacious behavior and showcasing the magnetic charm he wielded. even over hardened criminals. You're sailing across the Aegean Sea, the sun glinting off the water, a gentle breeze filling the sails. Suddenly, a pirate ship, oars churning, sails billowing, bears down on you. Not exactly a relaxing vacation, is it? Well, this is precisely what happened to Caesar. He was captured by Cilician pirates, notorious for their ruthless efficiency and their penchant for ransom. Most captives would have been terrified, perhaps even despondent. But Caesar reportedly treated his captors with a mixture of disdain and an almost unbelievable sense of entitlement. When they demanded a ransom of 20 talents of silver, Caesar scoffed. 20 talents? For him? He reportedly insisted they raise it to 50, claiming he was worth far more than their paltry initial offer. Can you imagine the pirates' faces? It's like demanding a small fee for a famous rock star, and they tell you they're worth a stadium tour. This quirky tidbit perfectly illustrates Caesar's supreme self-confidence, even when his life hung in the balance. For 38 days he remained their captive, but he didn't act like one. He ordered them to be quiet when he wanted to sleep, corrected their crude manners, and even composed speeches and poems, which he then read aloud to them. And if they didn't appreciate his literary genius, he'd reportedly call them illiterates and barbarians, often joking that he would crucify them all once he was free. Now, here's the kicker. The pirates, instead of being offended or enraged, reportedly loved him. They were entertained by his arrogance, amused by his wit, and captivated by his charm. They clearly didn't take his threats seriously, viewing them as good-natured banter. They bonded with him, seeing him more as a distinguished guest than a prisoner. This incredible ability to charm even those who held him captive and could kill him at any moment speaks volumes about Caesar's magnetic personality. It wasn't just physical attractiveness. It was an aura of power, intelligence, and undeniable confidence that drew people in. Historians still argue whether the pirates genuinely warmed to him, or if Caesar's accounts of his captivity were embellished to further his legend. Regardless, it certainly added another colorful, if slightly unbelievable, chapter to his growing reputation. Upon his release after the ransom was paid, Caesar wasted no time. He immediately raised a small naval force, hunted down his former captors, captured them, and, true to his word and to their shock perhaps, crucified them all. Well, almost all. As a gesture of mercy for their hospitality, he first had their throats cut to spare them prolonged suffering. You see, when Caesar made a joke, he meant business. This episode wasn't just a display of his unwavering determination and ruthlessness. It also highlighted his ability to turn any situation to his advantage, forging connections, even with unlikely allies, and then leveraging those connections to achieve his goals. This blend of charisma, cunning, and brutal efficiency would become a hallmark of his rise, not just in war, but in his personal conquests as well. He was truly a man who left an impression, whether you wanted one or not. After his dramatic escape from Sulla and his rather assertive dealings with pirates, Caesar returned to Rome, his reputation for daring preceding him. But his most enduring and perhaps most politically significant affair was yet to truly blossom, one that would tie him to one of the most famous assassinations in history, his long-standing relationship with Servilia. Now, you might not know Servilia by name, but you certainly know her son, Marcus Junius Brutus, the very Brutus who would later betray Caesar on the Ides of March. This wasn't just a casual fling. This was a deep, complex, and politically charged connection that lasted for decades. Servilia was a formidable woman in her own right. She belonged to one of Rome's most ancient and respected patrician families, the Junii, and was half-sister to Cato the Younger, Caesar's most vocal and irritatingly moralistic political opponent. So, right away, you can see the delicious irony here. The woman Caesar was deeply involved with was directly related to the man who spent his life trying to bring Caesar down. It's almost like finding out your archenemy is secretly dating your favorite aunt. But, with more togas and less awkward family dinners. Their affair likely began in the 60s BC, when Caesar was already a rising star, and Servilia was a married woman, first to Marcus Junius Brutus the Elder, father of our Brutus, and later to Decimus Junius Silanus. The relationship continued even after Caesar married his second wife, Pompeia, and possibly even into his third marriage. This wasn't a secret whispered once or twice. It was an open secret among the Roman elite, a testament to Caesar's audacity and Servilia's powerful standing, that it was tolerated, or at least acknowledged. Caesar was famously generous with Servilia, showering her with lavish gifts. One quirky tidbit: after his victory in the Civil War, he famously bought her a pearl for 6 million sesterces. To put that in perspective, a legionary's annual pay was around 900 sesterces. So, this pearl was worth the equivalent of thousands of soldiers' salaries. It was an astronomical sum, even for the wealthy Romans, and it sent a clear message about the depth of his affection, or at least his desire to publicly demonstrate it. Historians still argue whether this extravagant gift was purely a sign of his devotion to Servilia, a political maneuver to secure her family's loyalty, or a display of his new, almost limitless wealth and disregard for traditional decorum. Perhaps it was all three, because with Caesar, it was rarely just one thing. The influence of Servilia on Caesar is a fascinating, if shadowy, aspect of his life. She was a woman of intelligence and ambition, and she was clearly in Caesar's inner circle, privy to his thoughts and plans. While Caesar was known for his calculated ruthlessness, he showed a remarkable clemency towards Servilia's son, Brutus, after the Battle of Pharsalus, even going so far as to offer him high office. Many ancient sources attribute this leniency directly to Caesar's affection for Servilia. You can imagine the murmurs among the senators. Well, of course Brutus was spared. His mother has the emperor's heart, after all. This affair, therefore, wasn't just a private dalliance. It was a powerful thread woven into the fabric of Roman politics, influencing alliances, showing favor, and ultimately setting the stage for a tragic irony that would forever link Caesar, Servilia, and Brutus in the annals of history. While his long affair with Servilia continued quietly, Caesar, ever the pragmatist, understood the necessity of conventional political marriages. So, after Cornelia's death from natural causes, we presume, though in Rome, you never really knew, Caesar entered into his second significant union with Pompeia. This marriage, like his first, was less about fiery passion and more about cold, hard political calculation. Pompeia was related to Pompey the Great, one of the most powerful men in Rome at the time, and a key figure in the shifting sands of Roman power dynamics. For Caesar, marrying Pompeia was a brilliant strategic move, aligning him with a powerful faction and enhancing his own burgeoning political influence. It was the ultimate power couple move, long before anyone even coined the term. The marriage likely occurred around 67 BC. Pompeia was, by all accounts, a well-connected woman, suitable for Caesar's rising ambition. You can imagine the Roman elite nodding approvingly. Ah, young Caesar making all the right moves. So sensible, so traditional. They probably thought he was finally settling down, putting aside his youthful eccentricities. Little did they know that Caesar's personal life was destined to remain a swirling vortex of intrigue and scandal, no matter who he married. Their union, however, was destined for a rather ignominious and public end, thanks to a scandal that rocked Rome and became a juicy piece of Roman gossip for years to come. This brings us to the infamous Bona Dea affair. The Bona Dea Good Goddess was a Roman religious festival, exclusively for women, held annually in December. Men were absolutely forbidden to attend. Think of it as a sacred ladies' night, where even a peeking eye was considered a profound sacrilege. It was held at the home of a prominent Roman magistrate, and in 62 BC that magistrate happened to be Caesar, who was then praetor. So, the festival was held in his house, with his wife Pompeia as the hostess. Now enters Publius Clodius Pulcher, a notorious Roman rake and political provocateur, famous for his outrageous behavior and his penchant for breaking rules. Claudius, for reasons historians still argue about whether he was genuinely trying to seduce Pompeia or simply engaging in an act of political sabotage against Caesar, or perhaps just a very confused and drunk man decided to sneak into the Bona Dea festival disguised as a woman. Yes, you heard that right. A man dressed as a woman trying to infiltrate a sacred women-only religious ceremony. It's like a bad sitcom plot, but with potentially deadly consequences. A quirky tidbit. Claudius was supposedly caught by Pompeia's mother-in-law, Caesar's mother Aurelia, who spotted his unladylike shoes, or perhaps just his general male clumsiness. Talk about an awkward family moment. The ensuing scandal was enormous. The sacrilege was considered so grave that Claudius was put on trial. Caesar, ever the master of political maneuvering, famously divorced Pompeia amidst the scandal. His reasoning? He declared that Caesar's wife must be above suspicion. Not, mind you, that he believed she was guilty, or that he suspected Claudius had succeeded in his attempted liaison, but the mere suspicion of impropriety, the fact that his household had been at the center of such a profound religious transgression, was enough to make her politically untenable as his wife. Historians still argue whether this divorce was a cold, pragmatic political decision, a desperate attempt to distance himself from the scandal, or if he genuinely believed Pompeia was compromised. Whatever the underlying truth, it was a perfectly executed bit of political theater, ensuring that Caesar's reputation, at least publicly, remained untarnished by the affair, even as his private life continued to brew with complexity. And just like that, his second major marriage was over. The Bona Dea scandal, and Caesar's famously swift divorce of Pompeia, wasn't just a juicy piece of Roman gossip. It was a deeply significant event that reverberated through the political landscape of Rome. You see, the trial of Publius Clodius Pulcher, the man who dared to infiltrate the sacred women-only festival, became a massive public spectacle. It was less about religious piety and more about a power struggle between the conservative Roman elite, who saw Claudius as a symbol of decaying morals, and the more populist faction which Claudius represented. It was Rome's version of a sensational celebrity trial, complete with courtroom drama and thinly veiled political agendas. Caesar, as Pompeia's husband and the master of the house where the sacrilege occurred, was called as a witness. And this is where his political genius truly shone. Despite the widespread belief that Claudius was guilty, and despite the fact that his own wife's reputation was now dragged through the mud, Caesar testified that he knew nothing about the incident. Nothing. Can you imagine the gasps in the courtroom? He essentially gave Claudius a pass, protecting him from what could have been a devastating conviction. This quirky tidbit perfectly illustrates Caesar's willingness to sacrifice personal dignity, or at least his wife's, for political gain. He was playing the long game, forging an alliance with Claudius, a man who would become a powerful, if disruptive, force in Roman politics. Historians still argue whether Caesar's testimony was a genuine act of ignorance, a calculated lie to protect a future ally, or perhaps a demonstration of his pragmatic indifference to the sanctity of traditional Roman religion when it clashed with his ambitions. Whatever the truth, his famous declaration, "Caesar's wife must be above suspicion," became a timeless adage, effectively a clever smokescreen for a deeper political maneuvering. It wasn't about Pompeia's innocence. It was about Caesar's untainted public image, crucial for his ascent to power. He was clearing his name, not hers, from any lingering taint of the scandal. This episode cemented Caesar's reputation not just as a daring military man, but as a cunning politician who understood that appearances mattered, even when reality was far more complex. He divorced Pompeia not because he necessarily believed her complicit, but because her mere association with the scandal could undermine his own political gravitas. It was a cold, hard decision, but one that served his overarching ambitions perfectly. You just know that some of the old senators, the ones who loved their traditions more than their own children, probably muttered about the decline of Roman values under their breath. The fallout from the Bona Dea scandal further highlighted the volatile nature of Roman society and the intricate web of personal relationships, political alliances, and public perception that defined the elite. For Caesar, it was a test of his ability to navigate treacherous waters, and he passed with flying colors, emerging not only unscathed, but arguably stronger. His detachment from the scandal, despite being at its very heart, showcased a remarkable control over his public narrative. It was a lesson in crisis management, Caesar style. When in doubt, pivot, make a memorable quote, and ensure you come out looking like the aggrieved party, even if you're pulling all the strings behind the scene. This entire affair served as a stark reminder that in Rome, even sacred religious rituals were fair game for political manipulation, and Caesar was a master of the game. The Bona Dea scandal was far from the only whisper of infidelity swirling around Caesar. Even as he strategically divorced Pompeia, whispers of another audacious affair had long been circulating among the Roman elite. A liaison that, if true, would have been deeply provocative. You see, the rumors claimed he had an affair with Mucia Tertia, the wife of none other than Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, or as you probably know him, Pompey the Great. Yes, that Pompey, the very man who would later become Caesar's most significant political rival and eventual civil war opponent. Talk about complicated family trees. Mucia was Pompey's third wife, and their marriage had by all accounts faced its share of rocky patches. Pompey was often away on military campaigns, leaving Mucia in Rome. And as the Roman gossip mill would have it, absence did not always make the heart grow fonder, at least not for Mucia's fidelity. The rumors of her affair with Caesar, though never explicitly confirmed by Caesar himself or anyone else who wasn't actively trying to discredit him, were persistent. It was the kind of scandalous tale that would have spread like wildfire through the Roman baths, whispered in hushed tones over expensive wines. Imagine the discomfort at a Roman dinner party if both Caesar and Pompey were present, and everyone in the room knew exactly what the silent tension was about. It's like inviting your ex's new partner to Thanksgiving, but with the added layer of imperial ambitions and potential civil war. This particular affair, or the rumor of it, gained significant traction because of what happened after Pompey returned from his long military campaigns in the East, around 62 BC. Upon his return, he promptly divorced Mucia. Now, for a prominent Roman, divorcing a wife was not uncommon, as we've already discussed. But Pompey's stated reason for the divorce was Mucia's alleged infidelity. While he didn't explicitly name Caesar as the culprit, the timing and the general buzz around Rome certainly pointed fingers. A quirky tidbit. Some ancient sources suggest that Pompey discovered letters exchanged between Caesar and Mucia, though this remains unverified. Historians still argue whether Mucia's alleged affair with Caesar was a factual occurrence, a convenient rumor spread by Caesar's enemies to sow discord, or perhaps a retrospective invention by later historians to emphasize the long-standing rivalry between Caesar and Pompey. But, regardless of its absolute truth, the rumor itself served a purpose. It underscored Caesar's reputation as a man who played by his own rules, even in matters of the heart, and who was willing to push boundaries, even those involving powerful political figures. It presented him as a daring, perhaps even reckless individual whose ambition extended beyond the political arena into the personal lives of his rivals. It also added another layer of personal animosity to the growing political rivalry between Caesar and Pompey. Think about it. It's one thing to disagree on legislation. It's quite another to suspect your political adversary has been romantically involved with your spouse. This alleged liaison with Mucia Tertia highlights a recurring theme in Caesar's life. His affairs were rarely just affairs. They were often intertwined with his political maneuvering, serving to strengthen alliances, undermine rivals, or simply project an image of powerful, untamed virility. Even if the details are murky, The persistent whisper of such a scandalous betrayal certainly contributed to the perception of Caesar as a man whose private life was as daring and unconventional as his public career. And as the political tensions between Caesar and Pompey escalated, this personal betrayal, real or imagined, would undoubtedly add fuel to the fires of the impending civil war. You can almost feel the uncomfortable tension, can't you? It's like waiting for a storm to break, knowing that personal vendettas are mixing with political ambition. Section 11. The alleged affair with Mucia Tertia, Pompey's wife, brings us to a pivotal moment in Roman history, a moment where personal animosity and political ambition collided with explosive force. Caesar crossing the Rubicon. You see, the relationship between Caesar and Pompey, once allies in the first triumvirate, had completely deteriorated. They had been partners in power, carving up the Roman world between them. But now, their colossal egos and conflicting agendas had pushed them to the brink of civil war. And those whispers of Mucia, they certainly didn't help smooth things over, adding a personal, perhaps even deeply embarrassing, layer to their very public rivalry. It's like a corporate takeover turning into a family feud, but with actual legions instead of just angry lawyers. By 49 BC, the political tension in Rome was unbearable. Caesar, fresh off his incredibly successful campaigns in Gaul, was a hero to the common people and commanded fiercely loyal legions. The Senate, however, feared his immense power and popularity, seeing him as a threat to the Republic itself. They sided with Pompey, ordering Caesar to disband his army and return to Rome as a private citizen. But Caesar, a man who famously refused to divorce his first wife under duress, was certainly not about to relinquish his military command just because the Senate politely asked. The Rubicon was a small, shallow river in northern Italy, marking the boundary between Roman Gaul Caesar's province and Italy proper. Roman law strictly forbade any general from bringing his army across this river into Italy without the Senate's explicit permission. Crossing it with armed legions was an act of war, an open declaration of defiance against the Roman state. It was a line in the sand, literally and figuratively. And on January 10, 49 BC, Caesar, after reportedly hesitating for a moment, uttered the immortal words, "Alea acta est," the die is cast, and led his legions across the Rubicon. You can almost hear the collective gasp across Italy. This momentous decision wasn't made in a vacuum. Caesar's personal life, his daring nature, and his willingness to defy convention were intrinsically linked to his political and military audaciousness. The same confidence that led him to charm pirates or pursue forbidden lovers propelled him to take this monumental gamble. His personal style was a reflection of his strategic mind, bold, unapologetic, and always pushing the boundaries. Quirky tidbit. Ancient sources suggest that before crossing, Caesar experienced some kind of supernatural vision or omen, which further convinced him to proceed. Historians still argue whether this vision was a genuine mystical experience, a clever piece of self-promotion by Caesar, or simply a dramatic flourish added by later chroniclers. The act of crossing the Rubicon wasn't just a military move. It was a psychological one. It sent a clear message to Rome. Caesar was not backing down. He was staking everything on his ambition, just as he always had in his personal dealings. His disdain for traditional authority, evident in his treatment of the Senate and his scandalous affairs, now manifested on a grand scale. This move plunged Rome into a devastating civil war, pitting former allies against each other, and ultimately paving the way for the end of the Republic and the rise of the empire. The personal drama surrounding his relationships, particularly with the wife of his great rival, simply underscored the intense, often bitter nature of the conflict. It was a testament to how deeply intertwined personal lives and political power truly were in ancient Rome. And as the legions marched, the fate of Rome, and indeed Caesar's own legendary status, hung in the balance. Section 12. Caesar's audacity in crossing the Rubicon plunged Rome into a devastating civil war. But even amidst the chaos of conflict, his personal life, ever entwined with his political ambition, took its most legendary turn. His pursuit of Pompeii led him to the ancient sands of Egypt, a land of mystery, power, and, as it turned out, a queen who would become his most famous and impactful lover, Cleopatra. You've heard the name, of course. She's practically synonymous with seductive power, winged eyeliner, and perhaps a rather unfortunate asp incident. But their story is far more complex than just a romantic entanglement. It was a collision of two colossal egos, two brilliant minds, and two boundless ambitions. Imagine the scene. Caesar, hot on Pompey's heels, arrives in Alexandria in 48 BC. He expects to find his rival, but instead, he's greeted with news of Pompey's assassination, orchestrated by the advisors of the young pharaoh, Ptolemy, Cleopatra's brother and rival. Caesar, ever the pragmatist, was reportedly horrified by this act, seeing it as an affront to Roman dignity, regardless of his enmity with Pompey. But more importantly, he found himself embroiled in a simmering dynastic dispute between Ptolemy and his older sister, Cleopatra. Now, Cleopatra was not just a queen. She was a political mastermind. A polyglot, she was the only Ptolemaic ruler to bother learning Egyptian, a quirky tidbit that set her apart, and a woman determined to regain her throne. But she was trapped, under house arrest by her brother's faction. She knew Caesar was her only hope. And so, the legend goes, she orchestrated her dramatic entrance. She had herself smuggled into Caesar's quarters, famously rolled up in a carpet or a laundry bag, and delivered to him as a surprise. Can you imagine the look on Caesar's face? One minute you're plotting military strategy, the next a queen literally unfurls herself at your feet. It's certainly more exciting than your average Tinder date. This theatrical arrival immediately captivated Caesar. He was a man who appreciated boldness and intelligence, and Cleopatra, with her sharp wit and undeniable charm, possessed both in abundance. She wasn't necessarily a classical beauty by Roman standards, but she had a magnetic presence, a compelling voice, and a strategic mind that matched his own. Their connection was immediate and intense. It was a meeting of minds as much as a meeting of bodies, a strategic alliance disguised as a passionate affair. Historians still argue whether their initial attraction was genuinely love at first sight, a purely calculated political maneuver by both parties, or a desperate gamble by Cleopatra that simply paid off spectacularly. Perhaps, like most great historical romances, it was a complicated blend of all three. Caesar, now acting as an arbiter in the Egyptian civil war, openly sided with Cleopatra. His intervention led to a fierce struggle, the Alexandrian War, where his small force was besieged in the palace. But ultimately, with Roman reinforcements, he emerged victorious, securing Cleopatra's position on the throne, and crucially, making her completely indebted to him. This was more than just a romantic liaison. It was a political coup, ensuring Roman influence over the rich and strategically vital kingdom of Egypt. And for Caesar, who loved to combine personal pleasure with political gain, it was a perfectly orchestrated triumph. Their affair was just beginning, but its implications would echo throughout the Roman world. With Cleopatra firmly on the throne of Egypt, courtesy of Caesar's military intervention, their relationship deepened, morphing from a strategic alliance into an undeniable entanglement of power and passion. Imagine the opulent palace of Alexandria, a city pulsating with Hellenistic culture, intellectual fervor, and the scent of exotic perfumes. Here, in the heart of this ancient, vibrant metropolis, Caesar, the seasoned Roman general, and Cleopatra, the brilliant young queen, found themselves utterly consumed by one another. It was less a casual affair and more a high-stakes, opulent love affair playing out in the midst of a besieged palace. You'd think after a civil war and an Alexandrian siege, a man would just want a quiet cup of Roman chamomile. But no, not Caesar. Caesar spent several months in Egypt with Cleopatra after the war, a period that allowed their bond to solidify. He was captivated by her intelligence, her charm, and her ability to speak multiple languages, including Latin and Greek, allowing them to converse directly without the need for translators, a rare and incredibly attractive quality for a Roman, especially one as intellectually curious as Caesar. She wasn't just a conquest. She was a partner in conversation, a rival in wit. This was a sophisticated, educated woman who could hold her own with the most powerful man in the world, and Caesar clearly relished the challenge. Their time together was reportedly marked by lavish excursions and intimate moments. One quirky tidbit describes their famous pleasure cruise up the Nile, a luxurious journey lasting several weeks, accompanied by a fleet of 400 ships and presumably a lot of very tired oarsmen. This wasn't just a romantic getaway. It was a grand display of their intertwined power, parading their union before the Egyptian populace. It's hard to imagine what the Roman guards thought as they watched their general, who usually focused on military precision, getting caught up in such regal leisure. Historians still argue whether this prolonged stay in Egypt was primarily a strategic necessity to solidify Roman control over the region, an indulgence in a passionate affair, or a deliberate delay by Caesar to avoid the pressing political issues back in Rome. Perhaps it was a delightful combination of all three. For Cleopatra, Caesar represented not just a powerful lover, but the key to securing her reign and restoring the Ptolemaic dynasty to its former glory. For Caesar, Cleopatra offered not only companionship and intellectual stimulation, but also access to Egypt's immense wealth, crucial for funding his ongoing civil war efforts, and its strategic importance as a Roman ally. Their relationship was, therefore, a masterclass in combining personal gratification with political expediency. It was a partnership of equals in ambition, even if the power dynamic ultimately leaned towards Rome. You can almost feel the desert heat, the grandeur of the ancient temples, and the intoxicating scent of their ambition mingling in the air. His period in Egypt was more than just a love story. It was a foundational moment for Caesar's future. It set the stage for his most audacious political moves, his further consolidation of power, and would eventually lead to the birth of a child who would add another layer of complexity to his already legendary, and indeed scandalous, reputation. The Queen and the Conqueror, creating a legacy that would echo through history. The passionate affair between Caesar and Cleopatra in Egypt was not merely a romantic interlude. It bore significant fruit, quite literally. In June of 47 BC, a son was born to Cleopatra, and she proudly named him Ptolemy Caesar, though he would become universally known by a far more familiar name, Caesarion, meaning Little Caesar. You see, his very name was a bold, unmistakable claim. This child was the son of the most powerful man in the Roman world. Imagine the audacity. It's like announcing to the world via your baby's name that you're dating the head of a major superpower. The implications of this birth, both for Caesar and for Rome, were enormous, echoing far beyond the confines of the Alexandrian palace. For Cleopatra, Caesarion's birth was a brilliant strategic move. It solidified her alliance with Caesar, giving her a direct, undeniable link to Roman power. It also ensured the continuity of her own dynasty, blending the ancient lineage of the Ptolemies with the burgeoning might of the Roman conqueror. She presented him as Caesar's biological son, and there's little historical doubt that he was. Caesar himself never publicly acknowledged Caesarion as his legitimate heir in Rome, primarily because Roman law didn't recognize children born outside a legal Roman marriage as legitimate. However, he did allow Caesarion to inherit his name and supported Cleopatra's claim. A quirky tidbit: Caesarion was actually Cleopatra's first child, making him a truly pivotal figure in her life and reign. The existence of Caesarion posed a unique problem for Caesar back in Rome. He already had an adopted heir, Octavian, his grandnephew, who was being groomed for succession. Introducing a biological son, particularly one born to a foreign queen and outside Roman legal norms, would have thrown a massive wrench into his carefully laid plans for the future of his legacy. Historians still argue whether Caesar harbored genuine paternal affection for Caesarion, or if his acknowledgement of the child was purely a strategic concession to maintain his invaluable alliance with Cleopatra. Perhaps it was a complex blend of both, a man torn between personal feeling and political necessity. The birth of Caesarion undoubtedly fueled the already rampant gossip about Caesar's scandalous love life. Roman citizens, accustomed to a strict framework of legal marriage and legitimate heirs, would have viewed Caesarion's existence with a mixture of fascination and disapproval. This child, born of a foreign queen, symbolized everything that many traditional Romans feared about Caesar's increasingly monarchical tendencies and his disregard for established norms. The idea of a half-Egyptian, non-Roman heir to Caesar's immense power would have sent shivers down the spines of conservative senators who clung to the fading ideals of the Republic. It was another sign that Caesar was simply operating on a different playing field, one where old Roman rules seemed to apply less and less to him. Caesarion's birth marked a new profound phase in Caesar's relationship with Cleopatra. It was no longer just a passionate affair or a political alliance. It was now a family, however unconventional by Roman standards. This child, little Caesar, was a living testament to their powerful bond and a silent, yet potent, symbol of Caesar's imperial reach, extending even to the creation of a new, potentially illegitimate dynasty. The stage was set for Cleopatra to make her most dramatic move yet, bringing Caesarion and herself directly to Rome. You can practically hear the collective gasp from the Roman populace already. With Caesarion, her young son with Caesar in tow, Cleopatra made her grand, utterly unprecedented entrance into Rome in 46 BC. Imagine the scene. You're a Roman citizen, perhaps going about your daily business, haggling for olives in the market, or discussing the latest senatorial gossip. Suddenly, word spreads like wildfire that the Queen of Egypt, the Cleopatra, is arriving. And not just arriving quietly, but making a spectacle of it. This wasn't a discreet diplomatic visit. It was a dazzling, audacious display designed to shock, impress, and solidify her claim to Caesar's affection, and by extension his power. It was like a modern-day monarch arriving in a private jet. But instead of just landing, they're cruising down the main street on a gold-plated yacht. Caesar provided Cleopatra with lavish accommodations in his own private villa across the Tiber River, an estate that would become her personal Roman residence. This was an incredibly provocative act for a Roman general, especially one who still theoretically upheld republican ideals, to house a foreign queen, his acknowledged lover and the mother of his alleged son, within the sacred city walls, was a profound transgression of norms. She wasn't just in Rome. She was living with Caesar in all but official marriage, a very public acknowledgement of their illicit yet powerful bond. A quirky tidbit, her presence reportedly caused a sensation, with curious Romans flocking to catch a glimpse of the legendary queen, probably whispering about her beauty, her intelligence, and of course her scandalous affair with their leader. Cleopatra's objective was clear: to secure Caesarion's recognition as Caesar's heir, or at least to elevate her son's status as a legitimate potential successor. She brought with her a retinue of Egyptian scholars, priests, and courtiers, dazzling the Roman elite with exotic customs and intellectual discussions. Caesar himself reportedly consulted with Egyptian astronomers and mathematicians, leading to the calendar reforms that gave us the Julian calendar, a mainstream historical fact that directly resulted from their interaction. So, you can thank Cleopatra in part for knowing what day it is. Her presence, however, was a source of immense discomfort and scandal for many traditional Romans. The idea of a foreign monarch, particularly one who practiced incestuous marriage within her own dynasty, a common Ptolemaic practice, but abhorrent to Roman sensibilities, openly cohabiting with their leading citizen, was deeply offensive. It challenged Roman notions of purity, dignity, and the sanctity of marriage. They saw it as further proof of Caesar's increasingly tyrannical and un-Roman behavior. a blurring of lines between republic and monarchy. Historians still argue whether Cleopatra's presence in Rome was a strategic miscalculation on Caesar's part, fueling senatorial resentment, or a deliberate defiant statement of his power and disdain for traditional Roman opinion. You can almost hear the collective tut-tutting from the respectable Roman matrons as Cleopatra, in her opulent Egyptian finery, was carried through the streets. The rumors about her influence over Caesar, about their shared son, about her ambitions, spread like wildfire. She was not just a foreign queen, she was a living, breathing symbol of Caesar's untamed ambition and his willingness to defy every Roman convention. Her time in Rome, therefore, was less a diplomatic success and more a lightning rod for the growing opposition to Caesar's autocratic rule. It was a bold move by Cleopatra, and an even bolder one by Caesar, setting the stage for the dramatic end of his life, which, as you know, wasn't exactly a quiet retirement. Cleopatra's audacious presence in Rome, dwelling in Caesar's private villa with their son Caesarion, naturally ignited a firestorm of public opinion. You see, while Roman society had a certain tolerance for extramarital affairs among the elite, especially for powerful men, there were unspoken boundaries. Bringing a foreign queen, who claimed to have borne your son, into the very heart of Rome, and essentially living as man and wife, without the sanction of a legal Roman marriage, crossed a line for many. It was a scandal that played out not just in whispered corners, but in the very fabric of Roman public life. Imagine the ancient equivalent of tabloid headlines screaming about the emperor's foreign lover, but instead of newsstands, it's graffiti on walls and shouts in the forum. For the Roman plebs, the common citizens, Cleopatra might have been a source of fascination. They flocked to catch a glimpse of the exotic queen, a living embodiment of the wealth and grandeur that Caesar's conquests brought to Rome. She was a celebrity, a spectacle, a quirky tidbit of entertainment in their otherwise mundane lives. They might have admired her beauty, her rumored intelligence, or simply been awestruck by her opulent entourage. For them, she was a symbol of Caesar's boundless success, another jewel in his imperial crown. However, for the traditional Roman aristocracy and the staunch defenders of the Republic, Cleopatra was an abomination. She represented everything they feared about Caesar's increasing power and his perceived disregard for Roman traditions. They saw her as a foreign temptress, undermining Roman morality and potentially corrupting their leader with Eastern decadence. The idea of Caesarion, a half-Egyptian child born out of wedlock, as a potential heir was particularly alarming. It threatened the very notion of Roman identity and legitimate succession. The conservative senators, led by figures like Cicero, who despite his wit was often a very serious man, viewed her presence as an insult to the Republic and a clear sign of Caesar's monarchical ambitions. They probably needed more than just chamomile tea. They needed a strong Roman sedative. This growing resentment wasn't just about moral outrage. It was deeply political. Cleopatra's undeniable influence over Caesar and the lavish attention he bestowed upon her fueled fears that he intended to move the capital to Alexandria, or even to establish a Hellenistic-style monarchy with himself as king and Cleopatra as a queen. The very word king was anathema to Romans who had overthrown their monarchy centuries ago. Historians still argue whether Caesar truly intended to establish a monarchy, or if he was simply pushing the boundaries of republican norms to consolidate his power. Regardless, Cleopatra's presence certainly intensified these fears, transforming him from a powerful general into a dangerously ambitious monarch in the eyes of many. You can sense the palpable tension in the streets of Rome during this period. On one hand, the cheers for Caesar's military triumphs. On the other, the growing whispers of discontent, the unease about his growing hubris and his scandalous foreign paramour. Cleopatra, whether intentionally or not, became a lightning rod for the anti-Caesar sentiment. Her lavish lifestyle, her foreign ways, and her very existence in Rome highlighted the profound changes Caesar was enacting upon the city and its ancient customs. Her presence was a constant living reminder of Caesar's defiance of convention, and for his enemies it was a weapon they would wield in their efforts to bring him down. The stage was well and truly set for the dramatic climax of Caesar's life, fueled in part by the very public spectacle of his affair with the Queen of the Nile. While Cleopatra remains Caesar's most famous lover, and her story is undeniably captivating, it's crucial to acknowledge that whispers and outright accusations of other, perhaps even more scandalous, liaisons followed him throughout his life. Chief among these were the persistent rumors about his relationship with Nicomedes IV, the king of Bithynia. Now, you might be thinking, wait, a king? As in, a male king? Yes, indeed. In ancient Rome, same-sex relationships, particularly between older, more powerful men and younger, less powerful men, were not uncommon, though they were viewed differently depending on the context. But for a Roman leader to be perceived as the submissive partner in such a relationship was considered a profound humiliation, a mark of shame. It was a far cry from the image of the virile Roman conqueror. The rumors about Caesar and Nicomedes dated back to Caesar's youth, around 80 BC, when he served as a military legate in Bithynia. Nicomedes, a Hellenistic monarch, was reportedly known for his luxurious lifestyle and, shall we say, his appreciation for handsome young men. The accusation, fiercely pushed by Caesar's political enemies, was that Caesar had prostituted himself to the king to gain political favor or financial support. The most damaging version of the story claimed that Caesar, while delivering a fleet to the king, remained in Bithynia for an extended period, leading to salacious speculation about the nature of his stay. Imagine the political cartoons of the day, if they had them, depicting Caesar in a less than heroic light. This particular accusation was a recurring theme in the propaganda campaigns launched against Caesar throughout his career. His detractors, most notably Cicero and Catullus, gleefully hurled the epithet the Bithynian queen, or Nicomedes' concubine, at him. This wasn't just playful banter. It was a deliberate and calculated attempt to undermine his masculinity, his gravitas, and his suitability for leadership in Roman eyes. For Romans, a man who allowed himself to be sexually subjugated was considered weak and dishonorable, and certainly unfit to command legions or lead the republic. It was the ultimate insult, designed to emasculate him in the public eye. A quirky tidbit: Caesar, while denying the specific accusation of prostitution, never truly managed to shake off the nickname, and it followed him for the rest of his life. Even decades later, after his greatest triumphs, his enemies would still resurrect the Bithynian queen slur. Historians still argue whether there was any truth to the rumors of a sexual relationship between Caesar and Nicomedes. Some scholars dismiss it as pure political slander, a common tactic in the vicious Roman political arena. Others point to the persistence of the rumors and the seemingly nonchalant attitude of some Roman writers towards same-sex relationships, though usually in a dominant role, as evidence that there might have been some foundation to the claims, even if exaggerated. Regardless of the exact nature of their relationship, the accusation was a significant factor in shaping public perception of Caesar's private life. You see, Caesar's personal dalliances, whether real or rumored, were never just private matters. They were always intertwined with his public persona and his political battles. The Bithynian scandal, in particular, highlights the intense scrutiny and often brutal personal attacks that Roman politicians faced. For Caesar, a man who projected an image of invincible masculinity and military prowess, the Bithynian queen slur was perhaps the most enduring and irritating stain on his otherwise meticulously crafted public image. It was a constant reminder that even the great conqueror had vulnerabilities, or at least public relations challenges. And speaking of public relations, some of his contemporaries were masters of verbal jabs. The relentless political attacks on Caesar, particularly those concerning his alleged sexual escapades, were often delivered with a razor-sharp wit by his contemporaries. No one wielded the verbal dagger quite like Cicero, Rome's greatest orator, and a staunch defender of the Republic. You see, while Cicero and Caesar often found themselves on opposing sides of political debates, they also moved in the same elite circles, attending the same banquets, and often engaging in very public verbal sparring. Cicero's jokes about Caesar's love life weren't just funny. They were strategic, designed to chip away at Caesar's gravitas and portray him as less than the ideal Roman statesman. It was the ancient Roman equivalent of a late-night talk show host's monologue, but with much higher stakes and no commercial breaks. Cicero, with his famously eloquent and sarcastic style, never missed an opportunity to land a cutting blow. He was particularly fond of mocking the persistent rumors about Caesar's time in Bithynia with King Nicomedes. He famously quipped, "Who was it that brought the king of Bithynia with him after being his guest to Rome, and having taken him by the hand, embraced him in the sight of the whole people?" And the context was always clear, even if the precise words of the punchline are lost to time. He'd use phrases that were designed to evoke images of Caesar in a subservient, un-Roman role, like referring to him as Nicomedes' little bedmate, a quirky tidbit. Cicero once joked that Caesar had run up a debt of 6 million sesterces by just a single pearl for Servilia, referencing that exorbitant gift we mentioned earlier. It was a perfect blend of truth, exaggeration, and biting humor, designed to make Caesar look like a reckless spendthrift easily swayed by a woman. These weren't just personal insults. They were highly effective forms of political propaganda. In a society that valued traditional masculinity and dignity in its leaders, questioning a man's sexual role, particularly implying effeminacy or promiscuity, was a powerful way to undermine his authority. Cicero understood that while Caesar might be a military genius, he was also vulnerable to attacks on his character, especially given his famously unconventional lifestyle. Historians still argue whether Cicero genuinely believed all the rumors he spread about Caesar's sex life, or if he simply used them as convenient rhetorical weapons in his ongoing political battle. Most likely, it was a bit of both. Why let the truth get in the way of a good jab, especially when it served your political agenda? You can almost hear the hushed gasps and nervous chuckles as Cicero, standing in the forum, delivered one of his carefully crafted barbs. The Roman audience, accustomed to sharp political rhetoric, would have understood the subtext immediately. These jokes served not just to entertain, but to reinforce a narrative that Caesar, for all his brilliance, was morally suspect, too indulgent, and perhaps too much of a nonconformist to be trusted with the reins of the Republic. It was a constant reminder that Caesar's personal life was perpetually under scrutiny, a weapon to be wielded by his enemies. The very fact that Caesar, despite his immense power, couldn't completely silence these jokes speaks volumes. It shows the enduring power of gossip and satire in Roman society, and how even the most powerful men were susceptible to public ridicule. These witty, cutting insults from figures like Cicero kept Caesar's alleged indiscretions firmly in the public consciousness, shaping perceptions and fueling the anxieties of those who feared his ambition. It made Caesar appear human, fallible, and sometimes even a little ridiculous, which for a man building an imperial image was far from ideal. And speaking of other women, his romantic interests weren't limited to just a few prominent figures. Beyond the high-profile affairs with Servilia and Cleopatra, and the scandalous rumors involving Mucia and King Nicomedes, Caesar's reputation for having countless lovers was well established among the Roman elite. You see, ancient sources, particularly those written by his contemporaries and later biographers, frequently allude to a string of less documented, quieter affairs with various Roman matrons. These liaisons, though perhaps not as politically explosive as his relationship with Cleopatra, nonetheless contributed to his public image as a prodigious womanizer. It seems Caesar found time for love, or at least lust, between battles and legislative sessions. These were the kinds of whispers that would have circulated through Roman society, less about outright scandal and more about a persistent pattern of behavior. Roman women of high standing, even if married, often had a degree of social freedom that allowed for such discreet dalliances. And Caesar, with his famous charm, his undeniable charisma, and his ever-increasing power, would have been an irresistible magnet for many. Imagine the subtle glances across a crowded banquet hall, the exchanged smiles, the discreet notes passed by trusted slaves. It was a quieter game, perhaps, but one Caesar apparently played with consistent success. While specific names are less frequently cited for these quiet affairs compared to his more prominent relationships, the general consensus among ancient writers points to a man who was rarely without a mistress. Some sources even hint at his ability to charm the wives of his political opponents. A quirky tidbit that, if true, would have been a deliciously subtle form of psychological woo. You can just imagine the awkward small talk at a senatorial meeting. Lovely weather we're having, isn't it, Quintus? How's your wife, by the way? Just saw her looking particularly radiant yesterday. Historians still argue whether the sheer volume of these alleged affairs was an exaggeration by ancient writers, eager to paint Caesar as a larger-than-life figure in all respects, or a genuine reflection of his prolific romantic life, given his reputation for boundless energy. It's not entirely out of the realm of possibility that he was, indeed, quite busy in the bedroom. These less documented affairs highlight a crucial aspect of Roman elite society: the double standards. While a woman's infidelity could bring ruin and disgrace upon her family, a powerful man's extramarital exploits were often tolerated, even admired, as long as they didn't lead to overt public scandal or political instability. Caesar seemed to operate with this understanding, pushing the boundaries, but rarely, except perhaps with Cleopatra breaking them so flagrantly that it became utterly untenable. He was a master of managing appearances, even while indulging his desires. The constant flow of rumors, whether fully substantiated or not, built a consistent narrative around Caesar, that of a man of immense appetite, not just for power and conquest, but for pleasure. It shaped how Romans viewed him, both as a brilliant, dynamic leader and as a man whose personal conduct often veered into the unconventional. These quiet affairs, taken collectively, formed a significant part of the shocking truth about his countless lovers, reinforcing the image of a man whose life was as boundless and unconquerable in the private sphere as it was on the public stage. It's almost as if his motto was Veni vidi amavi, I came, I saw, I loved many. The long and brutal civil war finally drew to a close, and with Pompey defeated and the last remnants of senatorial opposition crushed, Caesar stood as the undisputed master of the Roman world. You might think that with such immense power consolidated, and Rome now his to shape, Caesar would finally settle into a quieter, more austere existence. Perhaps a focus on infrastructure or drafting long, boring laws. But if you've been following his journey, you know that's just not in his DNA. Instead, the post-Civil War period, though marked by his diligent efforts to rebuild and reform Rome, also saw his personal life continue to churn with new, if perhaps less documented, romantic interests. It seems that for Caesar, even world domination couldn't dull his appetite for, shall we say, companionship. With a brief respite from the constant pressures of military campaigning, Caesar found himself firmly entrenched in Rome, ruling as dictator for life. This new position of supreme authority didn't mean he retired from the social scene. On the contrary, his court became a hub of activity, drawing in aspiring politicians, ambitious generals, and of course many women eager to bask in the glow of his power. It was like being the most eligible bachelor in the world, but with an entire empire as your personal dating pool. While Cleopatra was still a prominent, if controversial, fixture in his life, remember her luxurious villa across the Tiber, Caesar was also rumored to have engaged in new romantic entanglements within the Roman elite. These weren't necessarily the grand, politically charged affairs of his earlier life, but rather more personal dalliances that underscored his continued virility and charisma. He was a man who still seemed to possess an irresistible allure, even as his hairline receded and the weight of the world rested on his shoulders. A quirky tidbit: one of Caesar's favorite forms of relaxation, even amidst his duties, was reportedly attending lavish banquets and engaging in lively conversation, which naturally provided ample opportunities for new acquaintances. Historians still argue whether these later affairs were simply a reflection of his enduring personal magnetism, a strategic way to keep various Roman families tied to him, or a sign of a man simply indulging in the pleasures available to a supreme ruler. You see, for Caesar, personal relationships were often inextricably linked to political power. Bestowing favor on certain women could be a subtle way of rewarding their families, or perhaps gaining intelligence from a rival faction. While his focus was undoubtedly on the monumental task of reshaping Rome and its empire, his personal life remained a testament to his boundless energy and his capacity for human connection, however fleeting some of those connections might have been. He was, at this point, the ultimate alpha, the man who had conquered the world, and there were many who wished to be conquered by him in various senses of the word. This period of Caesar's life, though overshadowed by his political reforms and the impending doom that awaited him, serves as a quieter confirmation of his enduring reputation as a prolific lover. He wasn't just a general who fought battles. He was a man who lived life to the fullest, embracing every opportunity, including those that involved romantic pursuits. His private life, even in these quieter moments, continued to define him, adding layers to the complex tapestry of his legend. It was a clear indication that even with absolute power, Caesar remained, at his core, a man driven by formidable appetites. And those appetites, as you can imagine, weren't confined to Rome's borders. Even after the civil war, with Rome under his firm control, Caesar's restless spirit and boundless ambition weren't confined to the political arena or the Roman bedroom. His military campaigns had taken him far and wide, and these foreign conquests, you see, weren't just about expanding Roman dominion. They also opened up new vistas for his romantic inclinations. Imagine him in the exotic locales he visited, the allure of distant lands presenting new opportunities for a man of his charm and power. It's like a globe-trotting rock star on tour, but with more swords and less stadium lighting. His campaigns in Gaul, for instance, lasted for years, immersing him in the cultures of various Celtic and Germanic tribes. While the primary focus was on brutal conquest and strategic maneuvering, historical whispers suggest that Caesar, ever the opportunist, didn't shy away from engaging with the local populations in more personal ways. Roman generals, in fact, often formed liaisons with local women in conquered territories, sometimes as a way to build political bridges, other times simply for personal gratification. It was a common, if rarely explicitly celebrated, aspect of military life. You can just imagine the discussions in a Roman camp. Another victory today, lads. And apparently, the general also conquered the local chieftain's daughter. While specific names from his Gallic escapades are, understandably, less documented than those of Roman matrons or foreign queens, the general impression among ancient biographers is that he maintained his reputation for prolific romantic conquests wherever he went. This wasn't just about power. It was also about the sheer novelty and exoticism of different cultures. A quirky tidbit: some accounts suggest that even certain Gallic queens or noblewomen might have been among his dalliances, drawn perhaps by his legendary reputation, or simply by the overwhelming force of his personality. Historians still argue whether these accounts are mere embellishments to further Caesar's image as an irresistible conqueror, or if they reflect genuine, albeit undocumented, romantic encounters during his extensive travels. You see, for Caesar, the world was his oyster, and that extended to all forms of pleasure and influence. His military prowess gave him unparalleled access, and his personal magnetism ensured that he could often take advantage of it. These foreign liaisons, whether fleeting or more substantial, served to reinforce his image as a man who commanded respect and attraction across all cultures and borders. It was a testament to his universal appeal, or perhaps to the universal appeal of absolute power. This broader canvas of his romantic life, extending beyond the confines of Rome, paints a more complete picture of Caesar as a man driven by formidable appetites. He wasn't just conquering lands, he was conquering hearts, breaking societal norms, and living a life that defied conventional expectations. His campaigns weren't just military exploits, they were also personal adventures, adding another layer to the complex, scandalous tapestry of his private life. And as his legend grew, so did the whispers about his many conquests, solidifying his reputation as the bald adulterer. With his reputation for romantic escapades stretching from the palaces of Rome to the distant lands of Gaul and Egypt, it's no surprise that a rather unflattering nickname stuck to Caesar like a particularly stubborn bit of lint on a toga. The bald adulterer. This epithet, reportedly coined by none other than Catullus, a biting Roman poet whom we'll discuss more in a moment, perfectly encapsulated the public perception of Caesar's private life. You see, it wasn't just his political ambition that stirred controversy. It was his blatant disregard for traditional Roman marital fidelity, combined with a physical attribute that, in ancient Rome, could be a source of personal insecurity. Imagine being the most powerful man in the world, conquering nations, and still getting teased about your thinning hair and your love life. Even Caesar probably needed a strong dose of self-confidence to brush that off. Baldness, in particular, was a sensitive topic for Roman men. While it wasn't a moral failing, it certainly wasn't seen as a sign of virility or attractiveness. Caesar himself was reportedly quite sensitive about his receding hairline and often combed his remaining hair forward to conceal it. A quirky tidbit: he was said to be particularly pleased when the Senate granted him the right to wear a laurel wreath at all times, not just as a symbol of victory, but because it conveniently covered his bald spot. So, the bald part of the nickname was a personal jab, hitting him where it might actually sting a little. The adulterer part, of course, was a direct reference to his notorious and numerous affairs. As we've explored, these weren't merely private matters. They were often public knowledge, whispered about, joked about, and used as political ammunition. From Servilia to Mucia to Cleopatra, Caesar seemed to collect lovers with the same enthusiasm he collected military victories. His enemies, especially those who clung to the fading ideals of the Republic, seized upon this aspect of his character as evidence of his moral decay and his unsuitability for leadership. They viewed his personal excesses as a mirror reflecting his political ambition, boundless, unchecked, and disrespectful of tradition. Historians still argue whether Caesar's prolific romantic life was genuinely a sign of moral depravity by Roman standards, or if his political enemies simply exaggerated typical elite male behavior to suit their propaganda. This nickname, the bold adulterer, became a kind of shorthand for everything the conservative Roman elite found objectionable about Caesar. It combined a personal vulnerability with a public moral failing, creating a potent image that resonated with many. It suggested a lack of self-control, a man driven by base appetites rather than noble Roman virtues. For a society that idealized gravitas, seriousness, and dignitas, dignity in its leaders, a man who was simultaneously a conqueror and a notorious philanderer, with a visible personal flaw to boot, presented a perplexing, almost contradictory figure. You can almost hear the snickers and whispers in the streets and in the Senate as this nickname circulated. It was a constant reminder that for all his power, for all his genius, Caesar was still subject to public scrutiny and ridicule, particularly when his personal life strayed so wildly from conventional Roman norms. It contributed significantly to the complex public perception of Caesar, not just as a revered military and political figure, but as a man whose private life was as scandalous and talked about as his triumphs. And as you'll see, some Roman poets took particular delight in exposing these less than dignified aspects of his character. Among the sharpest critics and most vocal gossips regarding Caesar's personal life was the brilliant, yet notoriously caustic Roman poet Catullus. You see, while Cicero launched political barbs, Catullus attacked with raw personal venom, often through his poetry. His verses, particularly those aimed at Caesar, were less subtle political jabs and more like literary hand grenades, exploding with insults about Caesar's morality, or lack thereof. He was the Roman equivalent of a disgruntled, incredibly talented blogger who just wouldn't hold back. Catullus, born into a wealthy equestrian family, was part of a vibrant literary circle in Rome, and his poems often reflected the scandalous private lives of the elite. He was particularly obsessed with a married Roman noblewoman named Clodia, whom he called Lesbia in his poems. Their tumultuous, passionate, and ultimately heartbreaking affair forms the core of much of his work. And it's through this lens of his own intense emotional experiences that he often viewed and criticized others, including Caesar. Now, Catullus didn't just hint at Caesar's indiscretions, he practically shouted them from the rooftops, particularly mocking Caesar's alleged sexual relationship with Mamora, a close friend and chief engineer under Caesar in Gaul. This was another deeply offensive accusation, not just because it implied a same-sex relationship, but because it suggested a Roman general was engaging in such behavior with a subordinate. Catullus's poems are full of graphic insults, calling Caesar and Mamora filthy sodomites and accusing them of depravity. A quirky tidbit: Catullus's most famous lines against Caesar are found in poem 57, where he essentially calls both Caesar and Mamora greedy and sexually promiscuous, using language that was shockingly explicit for the time. Historians still argue whether Catullus' attacks were primarily a result of genuine moral outrage, a reflection of personal animosity stemming from political differences, or simply a provocative way for a poet to gain notoriety by attacking the most powerful man in Rome. You can imagine Caesar's reaction to these verses. A man who commanded legions and conquered nations was being publicly ridiculed by a poet whose primary weapon was verse. While Caesar reportedly dismissed Catullus' poems as mere lampoons and even invited the poet to dinner to seemingly make amends, the fact that he felt the need to respond at all shows that the insults stung. Even the great conqueror was not immune to public humiliation, especially when it touched on his perceived virility and Roman dignity. Catullus's biting verses provide us with invaluable insight into the sheer audacity of Roman satire, and the ways in which personal lives were scrutinized and weaponized in the public sphere. They highlight the paradox of Caesar, a man of immense power and achievement, yet perpetually dogged by accusations of moral looseness and sexual excess. These poetic taunts reinforce the image of the bald adulterer, making it clear that no amount of military glory could completely erase the whispers of his scandalous private life. It was a constant reminder that for all his control over the Roman world, Caesar couldn't completely control the narrative around his bedroom antics. And speaking of bedrooms, the concept of marital fidelity in Rome was, shall we say, a bit more flexible than you might imagine. Amidst all the scandalous whispers and poetic jabs about Caesar's countless lovers, it's important to remember the stated Roman ideal of marital fidelity. You see, publicly, Roman society championed the virtues of a faithful wife and a dignified husband. The matrona, the respectable married woman, was expected to be chaste, devoted to her husband and family, and manage the household. For men, while they had more leeway, public opinion still favored a certain degree of self-control and commitment to their marriage, at least on the surface. It was the Roman version of do as I say, not as I do, but with more emphasis on the do as I say for everyone else. However, as you've already gathered from Caesar's life, this ideal was, more often than not, rarely met, particularly within the elite circles of Rome. The reality was a complex tapestry of political marriages, discreet affairs, and a surprising amount of tolerance for male promiscuity, as long as it didn't lead to public disgrace or threaten the social order too overtly. It was a society that valued appearances and reputation above all else, which meant that a scandal wasn't about the act itself, but about getting caught in a way that couldn't be spun or ignored. The hypocrisy was, at times, glaring. A Roman husband could engage in extramarital affairs with slaves, prostitutes, or even unmarried foreign women without much social stigma. But if he was caught with another Roman matron, especially one from a prominent family, it could escalate into a major scandal. Not because of moral outrage, but because it interfered with another powerful man's property rights, his wife being legally his property. And for a wife, infidelity was a far more serious offense, often leading to immediate divorce and severe social ostracism. A quirky tidbit. Some Roman jurists even debated whether a man could justly divorce his wife simply for attending gladiator games without his permission, highlighting the rigid control husbands were expected to have over their wives' public lives, even as their own private lives were often unrestrained. Historians still argue whether this widespread discrepancy between ideal and reality contributed to the decline of Roman morality, or if it was simply a pragmatic reflection of a patriarchal society where power dictated sexual norms. What is clear is that figures like Caesar, with their immense power and boundless appetites, often pushed these boundaries to their absolute limit, becoming living testaments to the gap between official virtue and actual practice. He was the exception that proved the rule, or perhaps the rule that proved the exception. You can imagine the conversations among the Roman elite, publicly lamenting the decay of morals while privately indulging in the very behaviors they condemned. It was a fascinating, often contradictory, social landscape where personal desires constantly clashed with public expectations. Caesar, with his almost brazen disregard for traditional marital fidelity, stood out even among a class already known for its lax interpretation of such norms. His numerous liaisons weren't just about personal pleasure. They were a subtle, yet powerful, assertion of his status, a man so powerful, so beyond reproach, that even the strictest social conventions seemed to bend for him. It showed that for all their talk of virtus and pietas, the Romans were ultimately human, with all their complex desires and hypocrisies. And Caesar, more than anyone, knew how to capitalize on those complexities. This brings us to a closer look at the raw appeal that allowed him to get away with so much. So, what was it about Caesar that made him such an irresistible force, not just on the battlefield, but also in the boudoir? It boils down to one undeniable trait: his charisma. This wasn't just a superficial charm. It was a magnetic allure, a potent combination of intellect, ambition, and an almost superhuman confidence that drew people to him like moths to a flame. You see, Caesar possessed that rare quality that made everyone, from the lowliest soldier to the most powerful senator, feel as though he was speaking directly to them, understanding them, and ultimately captivating them. It was like he had a superpower, and it was called making people like him, even when they probably shouldn't. He was known for his sharp wit, his eloquent speeches, and his ability to remember names and faces, even of common soldiers. Imagine being a regular foot soldier, fighting under his command, and Caesar suddenly remembers your name, asks about your family, and cracks a joke. That kind of personal touch fostered fierce loyalty, and for many, a deep admiration that bordered on adoration. This charisma extended naturally into his romantic pursuits. He wasn't just powerful, he was genuinely fascinating. He could discuss philosophy with a scholar, military strategy with a general, and, presumably, the latest gossip with a Roman matron, all with equal ease and genuine interest. Caesar was also undeniably handsome in his youth, with keen eyes and a striking presence. Even as he aged and began to bold a fact he famously tried to conceal, remember, his aura of power and intellect only seemed to grow. For many women, being associated with a man of such immense power and renown was a status symbol in itself, a way to elevate their own standing within Roman society. It was the ancient equivalent of dating a rock star or a tech mogul, but with the added bonus of potentially influencing the course of an empire. A quirky tidbit that speaks to his charisma. After his military victories, Caesar was known for his incredible generosity, lavishing gifts not just on his soldiers, but also on the public and, as we've seen, on his lovers. This generosity, combined with his public persona as a champion of the common people, further enhanced his appeal. He knew how to win hearts, whether by military might, political maneuvering, or simply by being incredibly engaging. Historians still argue whether Caesar's charisma was an innate personality trait, a meticulously cultivated aspect of his public persona, or a combination of both. Given his flair for drama and self-promotion, it's likely he honed his natural charm into a powerful political tool. You can almost feel the pull of his presence, even centuries later, through the historical accounts. This magnetic allure allowed him to command legions, win elections, and, yes, attract a multitude of lovers from all walks of life. It's this charisma, this indefinable quality, that truly ties together the disparate threads of his military genius, his political ambition, and his notoriously scandalous private life. It was the secret sauce, the special ingredient that allowed him to defy conventions, survive countless challenges, and remain a figure of immense fascination, even as his personal life blurred the lines of acceptable Roman behavior. And speaking of blurred lines, his love life often got tangled up with political alliances. Caesar's personal charisma and his myriad affairs weren't just about private indulgence. They were often deeply interwoven with the intricate political alliances that defined his rise to power. You see, the Roman political landscape was a constant dance of favors, influence, and strategic partnerships, and even his romantic liaisons could become threads in this complex triumvirate's web. Remember the first triumvirate? That informal, yet incredibly powerful alliance between Caesar, Pompey the Great, and Marcus Licinius Crassus? This wasn't just a handshake agreement. It was a delicate balance of personal relationships, shared ambitions, and yes, even intertwined love lives. Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus needed each other to achieve their goals, whether it was to push through legislation, secure military commands, or simply dominate Roman politics. And how better to solidify such an alliance than through marriage? Caesar famously gave his beloved daughter Julia in marriage to Pompey. This was a hugely significant move. Julia was Caesar's only legitimate child, and by all accounts he adored her. To offer her in marriage to his primary political partner was the ultimate gesture of trust and commitment, a way to bind their personal lives inextricably with their political fates. It was the ancient equivalent of a corporate merger where the CEO's kids also get married. This marriage, while politically motivated, reportedly blossomed into a genuine love match. Julia, despite the age difference with Pompey, became deeply devoted to him, and he to her. This personal bond between his daughter and his co-triumvir, a quirky tidbit in a world of cynical power plays, provided a crucial human element to the often brutal political alliance. It acted as a personal glue, softening the sharp edges of their individual ambitions and helping to maintain a fragile peace between the two colossal figures. Historians still argue whether Caesar foresaw the genuine affection that would develop between Julia and Pompey, or if he merely made a strategic political calculation that happened to have a happy personal outcome for his daughter. However, the strength of this personal bond also highlighted its fragility. When Julia tragically died in childbirth in 54 BC, the personal tie between Caesar and Pompey was severed. Her death removed the most significant emotional link between the two men, allowing their simmering rivalry to escalate unchecked. Then, a year later, Crassus was killed in Parthia, removing the third leg of the triumvirate and leaving Caesar and Pompey as solitary giants destined to clash. You can see how deeply personal relationships, even seemingly conventional marriages, were entwined with the highest levels of Roman power. Caesar's romantic life wasn't just a series of flings. It was a strategic asset, a tool to forge alliances, and sometimes a source of profound personal connection that could, in its absence, lead to devastating political consequences. The web of the triumvirate, therefore, was spun not just with political agreements, but with threads of love, marriage, and tragically loss. And speaking of his cherished daughter, her story is a poignant one. Among the myriad relationships in Caesar's tumultuous life, one stands out for its genuine affection and profound political significance: his bond with his daughter, Julia. You see, while his marriages were often strategic alliances and his affairs passionate, sometimes scandalous, dalliances, his relationship with Julia was, by all accounts, one of deep paternal love and devotion. She was his only legitimate child, and he cherished her fiercely. It's a poignant contrast to the often ruthless world of Roman politics, a rare glimpse of a softer, more tender side to the formidable conqueror. Julia was born from Caesar's first marriage to Cornelia, and she grew into a woman of considerable beauty and intelligence. Her significance in Caesar's life wasn't just personal. It became a crucial political tool. As we discussed, Caesar married her to Pompey the Great in 59 BC, solidifying the first triumvirate. This was a marriage of immense political consequence designed to bind Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus together in a powerful informal alliance that effectively controlled Rome. It was the ultimate family merger, where personal happiness was a bonus, not the primary objective. However, against all expectations in such a politically motivated union, Julia and Pompey reportedly fell deeply in love. Pompey, a stern and often reserved military man, was genuinely devoted to his young wife, and she, in turn, adored him. This genuine affection was a powerful personal glue that helped to maintain the fragile peace between Caesar and Pompey, two colossal figures whose ambitions were increasingly at odds. A quirky tidbit: there are stories of Pompey canceling important public engagements or delaying military deployments just to spend time with Julia, a testament to his deep affection for her. Imagine the shock of the Roman senators. The mighty Pompey missing a vote for love. Historians still argue whether this genuine affection between Julia and Pompey was a stroke of unexpected luck for Caesar, or if he possessed a shrewd understanding of human nature that allowed him to predict such a bond might form. Julia's influence as the personal link between two of Rome's most powerful men cannot be overstated. She was a calming presence, a buffer against their escalating rivalries. While she held no official political power, her personal relationship with both men gave her an unparalleled, albeit indirect, influence on Roman affairs. She was the quiet anchor in the stormy sea of the triumvirate. Tragically, this crucial bond was severed by an untimely death. In 54 BC, Julia died in childbirth, along with her infant. Her death was a devastating blow to both Caesar and Pompey. For Caesar, it was a profound personal loss, the death of his beloved daughter. For Pompey, it was the loss of his cherished wife and their unborn child. But perhaps even more significantly, her death removed the personal link that had tenuously held the triumvirate together. With Julia gone, the last true emotional barrier between Caesar and Pompey evaporated, allowing their political ambitions to clash without restraint. You can almost feel the tension building, the inevitable conflict looming closer. Her passing marked a turning point, accelerating the disintegration of the first triumvirate and paving the way for the devastating civil war that followed. It's a stark reminder that even in the lives of the most powerful individuals, personal tragedy can have immense historical consequences. The tragic death of Julia, Caesar's beloved daughter, irrevocably altered the political landscape of Rome, setting the stage for the inevitable clash between Caesar and Pompey. But even after Caesar's momentous crossing of the Rubicon and his ultimate victory in the Civil War, the drama surrounding his personal life didn't end. Oh no, it continued even after his death, most notably through the post-mortem slander delivered by his political adversaries, eager to tarnish his legacy and justify their own actions. You see, in Rome, a politician's reputation wasn't safe even in the grave. It was like a never-ending mudslinging contest, where even the deceased were fair game. After Caesar's assassination on the Ides of March in 44 BC, Rome was plunged into a new period of turmoil. Among the key players vying for power was Mark Antony, Caesar's loyal general and friend, who sought to uphold Caesar's legacy. On the other side were the conspirators, led by Brutus and Cassius, who claimed to have saved the Republic from tyranny. In this bitter struggle for control, Caesar's private life became a potent weapon. Mark Antony, in his famous funeral oration for Caesar, which, by the way, was a masterpiece of rhetoric and arguably sparked a furious public reaction against the assassins, cleverly used Caesar's public and private life to stir emotion. While he certainly wouldn't have highlighted the scandalous aspects, he would have focused on Caesar's immense popularity, his generosity, and his connection to the common people. But after his death, particularly as the civil war between Antony and Octavian Caesar's adopted heir against Brutus and Cassius escalated, Caesar's enemies, especially the conspirators, turned his scandalous reputation against him. They resurrected every rumor, every accusation, every cutting joke, particularly the old slur about Nicomedes of Bithynia. You can imagine the conspirators trying to drum up support, saying things like, "We didn't kill a great leader. We killed the Bithynian queen's former lover." They painted him as a morally corrupt tyrant, driven by insatiable appetites rather than genuine public good. It was an attempt to retroactively justify their assassination, to argue that he was not worthy of the divine honors Antony and Octavian were trying to bestow upon him. A quirky tidbit: Plutarch, a Greek biographer, recounts that the conspirators themselves, during their public addresses after the assassination, brought up Caesar's notorious affairs, including his relationship with Cleopatra, to discredit him in the eyes of the Roman populace. Historians still argue whether this post-mortem slander was genuinely believed by the populace, or if it was simply a cynical attempt by the conspirators to manipulate public opinion in their favor. You see, Caesar's enemies understood that while his military victories were undeniable, his personal life, with its constant flouting of Roman norms, remained a vulnerable point. By emphasizing his alleged debauchery, his perceived effeminacy from the Bithynian rumors, and his scandalous foreign paramour, they aimed to undermine the very legitimacy of his rule and the posthumous veneration he was receiving. It was a vicious cycle. His life had been defined by scandals, and even his death couldn't escape them. This continuous assault on his character, even in death, underscores just how deeply intertwined his private life was with his public persona, and how even after his demise, Caesar's secret sex life remained a potent, controversial force in Roman politics. Politics. It was a testament to the fact that in ancient Rome, history was written not just by the victors, but also by those who held the sharpest pens and the most biting tongues. The conspirators who assassinated Caesar, including his close friend and adopted son Brutus, vehemently argued that their act was not murder, but a necessary defense of the Roman Republic against a tyrant. You see, the relationship between Caesar, Brutus, and Brutus' mother, Servilia Caesar's long-term lover, adds a profoundly complicated and intensely personal layer to the assassination. This wasn't just a political hit. It was, for some, a twisted family affair, soaked in complex loyalties and betrayals. Imagine a family drama where the stakes are not just Thanksgiving dinner, but the fate of an empire. Brutus was Servilia's son, and many ancient sources, including Plutarch, hint at a widespread rumor that Brutus was actually Caesar's illegitimate son. Now, before you gasp and spill your Roman wine, this was likely more a product of gossip and the conspirators' desire to discredit Brutus by painting him as a hypocrite for killing his own father than a verifiable biological fact. Caesar was only about 15 years older than Brutus, making biological paternity unlikely. However, Caesar did treat Brutus with exceptional favor, almost paternal affection. He repeatedly spared Brutus after battles, offered him high office, and generally showed him a level of clemency and trust that he rarely extended to others. This preferential treatment fueled the rumors, and it's a quirky tidbit that adds a dramatic flourish to an already dramatic story. This special relationship, whether familial or simply a deep mentorship influenced by his affection for Servilia, makes Brutus' betrayal all the more shocking and tragic. Caesar reportedly felt a deep personal wound from Brutus's involvement in the assassination. The famous line, "Et tu, Brute?" "You too, Brutus?" whether historically accurate or a later dramatic invention, perfectly captures the sense of profound personal betrayal. Historians still argue whether Caesar's clemency towards Brutus was purely due to his affection for Servilia, a strategic political move to win over a respected republican, or if he genuinely saw Brutus as a potential heir to his political ideals. Servilia herself, as Caesar's long-term lover and Brutus' mother, was caught in an impossible position. She had maintained a powerful, influential connection with Caesar for decades, benefiting from his generosity and trust. Yet, her son became the leader of the conspiracy against him. What were her feelings? Did she know? Did she try to dissuade Brutus? Ancient sources are largely silent on her direct involvement in the conspiracy, but her position must have been agonizingly conflicted. You can imagine the tension in the family villa, a mother torn between her powerful lover and her ambitious son, knowing the tragic path they were both on. The assassination, therefore, wasn't just the culmination of political rivalries. It was a deeply personal tragedy for Caesar, involving figures intricately woven into the fabric of his private life. The complex dynamics between Caesar, Servilia, and Brutus highlight how even the most powerful men in Rome were enmeshed in a web of personal relationships that could, ultimately, determine their fate. It underscores that for Caesar, the bedroom and the battlefield were never entirely separate spheres. Personal connections, whether loving or betraying, continually shaped his destiny. And with Caesar gone, it was up to his adopted son to manage the chaotic aftermath, and crucially, to manage Caesar's sprawling and often scandalous legacy. The vibrant, often scandalous, private life of Julius Caesar, with its endless array of lovers and political entanglements, thrived in an environment that was absolutely obsessed with Roman gossip. You see, long before the advent of social media or even printed newspapers, the Roman world was a buzzing hive of whispers, rumors, and scandalous tales. Information, true or false, spread like wildfire through the forum, the public baths, the dinner parties, and the bustling streets. It was the ultimate ancient social network, fueled by word of mouth and the insatiable human desire for juicy details about the powerful. Imagine trying to keep a secret in a city where everyone knew everyone else's business, and the walls quite literally had ears. This wasn't just idle chatter. Gossip was a powerful force in Roman society. It could make or break reputations, influence political careers, and even incite public unrest. For the elite, maintaining a pristine public image was paramount, even if their private lives were anything but. But the nature of Roman society, with its close-knit aristocratic families and public spaces, made true privacy almost impossible. Slaves, clients, and even casual acquaintances could carry tales, and in the hands of a skilled orator or a malicious rival, those tales could become potent weapons. Caesar, as the most powerful and charismatic man of his age, was naturally the subject of endless speculation. His defiance of convention, his dramatic rise to power, and his notoriously unconventional personal life made him prime fodder for the Roman rumor mill. Every alleged affair, every lavish gift, every audacious act was scrutinized, dissected, and then embellished as it passed from one tongue to another. A quirky tidbit: some ancient sources suggest that the very latrines in the forum were hotbeds of gossip, with Romans sharing the latest whispers while attending to nature's call. It seems nowhere was safe from the prying ears and wagging tongues. Historians still argue whether the prevalence of gossip in Rome was a symptom of a society with too much idle time, or if it served a crucial function as an informal system of checks and balances. allowing public opinion to exert pressure on powerful figures. Yad Cater on law on the Drainid-Sihe. You can almost picture a Roman citizen, perhaps a baker, leaning over his counter, eager to hear the latest about the bald adulterer from a passing senator, or a group of matrons gathered in a villa, discreetly sharing knowing glances as they discussed Cleopatra's latest public appearance. The rumors about Caesar's relationships, whether they were with Servilia, Mucia, or the Queen of the Nile, weren't just about sensationalism. They were about understanding the man behind the legend, and perhaps, more importantly, understanding the man behind the legend, and perhaps more importantly, understanding the shifting tides of power in Rome. This constant flow of whispers and scrolls about Caesar's secret sex life made him both adored and reviled, but never ignored. It ensured that his personal life was inextricably linked to his public persona, becoming a permanent part of his historical narrative. His daring romantic escapades weren't just private matters. They were public discourse, shaping perceptions, fueling political debates, and ultimately contributing to the legend that has endured for millennia. For Caesar, it seems, even his bedroom wasn't entirely his own. It belonged in part to the ever-curious, ever-gossiping Roman populace. And as we know, not everyone survived the political turbulence that followed his death. The assassination of Caesar in 44 BC sent shockwaves through Rome, ushering in a period of intense instability and civil war. For Cleopatra, who had been residing lavishly in Caesar's villa in Rome, this event was nothing short of catastrophic. Her protector, her lover, the father of her child Caesarion, was gone. And with his death, her privileged position in the heart of the Roman world became not just untenable, but dangerous. You see, the Roman public and elite, who had largely tolerated her presence out of respect or fear for Caesar, now viewed her as a foreign interloper, a symbol of the very monarchical ambitions they had just violently rejected. It was like suddenly finding yourself at a party where everyone now openly despises you, and the host is dead. Her primary objective in Rome, the hope of securing Caesarion's recognition as Caesar's heir, evaporated overnight. Antony, Caesar's loyal lieutenant, might have been sympathetic, but even he couldn't afford to alienate the fiercely anti-monarchical sentiments of the Roman people by openly supporting a foreign queen and her illegitimate son. So, with her political ambitions in Rome now a smoking ruin, Cleopatra made the pragmatic, if heartbreaking, decision to return to Egypt. Her departure from Rome was a quiet, almost hurried affair, a stark contrast to her grand, triumphant arrival. She left with Caesarion, retreating to the safety of her own kingdom, the vast wealth and strategic importance of Egypt still providing her with a powerful base. It was a retreat, yes, but not a surrender. She knew that her destiny, and that of her son, was still intertwined with Rome. But for now, the Roman stage was too dangerous. A quirky tidbit: some accounts suggest she took with her not just her son and retinue, but also some of Caesar's personal effects, perhaps as mementos, or perhaps as symbols of her enduring connection to the fallen dictator. Historians still argue whether her departure was truly a flight for survival or a calculated strategic withdrawal, awaiting the opportune moment to re-engage with Roman politics. You can imagine the relief among the Roman elite as Cleopatra's fleet sailed away. The foreign queen was gone. The symbol of Caesar's excesses removed from their sight. But her return to Egypt didn't mean she disappeared from the Roman narrative. Far from it. She remained a powerful player on the world stage, a force to be reckoned with, and eventually she would re-enter the Roman consciousness in an even more dramatic fashion, becoming entangled with Mark Antony, setting the stage for the final civilist war of the Republic. Cleopatra's departure marked the end of an era for Caesar's personal life. His most famous and influential lover was gone, leaving behind a profound void and a complex legacy. But the events that followed her departure, driven by the power vacuum Caesar's assassination created, would ultimately lead to the tragic downfall of Cleopatra herself. and the complete transformation of the Roman world. Her story, intricately linked to Caesar's, would become a cautionary tale of ambition, love, and ultimate demise, a testament to the fact that not all grand love affairs have happy endings. And as you'll see, Caesar's end was far from quiet. The assassination of Julius Caesar on the Ides of March 44 BC remains one of the most dramatic and pivotal moments in Western history. You see, this wasn't just a political act. It was a profoundly personal and political betrayal. A conspiracy involving dozens of senators, many of whom Caesar considered friends, and even some he had shown clemency to after the Civil War. It was the ultimate tragic irony. A man who had conquered the world brought down not by external enemies, but by those within his own inner circle. Imagine walking into a board meeting only to find out all your colleagues are about to stab you. Not ideal. Caesar had consolidated immense power, being declared dictator for life. While he enacted numerous popular reforms and brought stability after years of civil war, his actions increasingly suggested monarchical ambitions, a notion deeply repugnant to many Romans who cherished the ideals of the Republic. The laurel wreath, his statue placed among the gods, his pervasive image on coins, and especially his open relationship with Cleopatra and their son Caesarion, all fueled fears that he intended to make himself king and establish a dynastic rule. A quirky tidbit: some ancient sources claim that on the day of his assassination, Caesar ignored several bad omens, including his wife Calpurnia's nightmares and a soothsayer's warning about the Ides of March. He truly thought he was untouchable. The conspirators, numbering around 60 senators, saw themselves as liberators defending the Republic from a tyrant. Among them were figures like Brutus and Cassius, whom Caesar had forgiven and promoted despite their earlier opposition. They ambushed him at a meeting of the Senate in the theater of Pompey. Caesar reportedly fought back initially, but upon seeing Brutus among his attackers, he supposedly uttered his famous, albeit possibly apocryphal, last words, "Et tu, Brute." You too, Brutus. Whether he said it or not, the sentiment holds true. The betrayal by those he trusted, particularly Brutus, was a profound shock. Historians still argue whether Caesar's assassination was a necessary act to save the Republic from a dictator, or a short-sighted act of violence that ultimately paved the way for an even more autocratic empire. What is clear is that the motives of the conspirators were complex, a mix of genuine Republican ideology, personal grievances, and perhaps even jealousy of Caesar's immense power and charisma. The shocking truth of his countless lovers and his public relationship with Cleopatra undoubtedly contributed to the resentment against him, painting him as a man whose moral compass was as askew as his political ambitions were boundless. His perceived disregard for Roman traditions, both in governance and in his private life, certainly made him an easier target for those who sought to remove him. The assassination wasn't just the end of Caesar's life. It was the violent climax of years of tension, both political and personal. It demonstrated that even the most powerful man in the world could be brought down by those closest to him, especially when personal slights and perceived moral failings intertwined with grand political narratives. His death plunged Rome into another round of civil wars, ultimately leading to the rise of Octavian and the definitive end of the Roman Republic. It was a moment where the personal truly became the political, with devastating consequences. The infamous assassination of Julius Caesar, with its multiple stab wounds and tragic end in the theater of Pompey, leads us back to a particularly poignant and complex relationship, the one between Caesar and Brutus, the very man who delivered one of the fatal blows. You see, the idea of Brutus's betrayal is often viewed as the ultimate act of treachery, and it was certainly deeply personal for Caesar. But the layers of this particular family affair are incredibly intricate, blurring the lines between political principle and personal obligation. It's like a Greek tragedy, but with real-life consequences for an entire empire. As we touched upon earlier, Brutus was the son of Servilia, Caesar's long-term and deeply favored mistress. This connection alone made Brutus a special figure in Caesar's life. Caesar not only spared Brutus after the Battle of Pharsalus, where Brutus had fought on Pompey's side, but he also showered him with honors and promotions. He made him governor of Cisalpine Gaul and even praetor, putting him on a fast track for the consulship. This clemency and preferment, extended to an ideological opponent, was highly unusual for Caesar, and many ancient sources explicitly attribute it to his deep affection for Servilia, and perhaps a paternal feeling towards Brutus himself. A quirky tidbit: some sources suggest Caesar even publicly referred to Brutus as "my boy" or "my son," further fueling the rumors of their biological connection, even if it was unlikely. Brutus, however, was a staunch Republican, a man deeply committed to the ideals of Roman liberty and the overthrow of kings. He believed that Caesar's unchecked power and monarchical tendencies threatened the very existence of the Republic, which his own ancestors had fought to establish. He was a man of principle, or at least he saw himself as such. Historians still argue whether Brutus' primary motivation was a genuine love for the Republic, a desire for personal glory, or a more complicated mix of both, perhaps even influenced by the perceived dishonor of his mother's long affair with Caesar. The internal conflict Brutus must have faced was immense. On one hand, the man who had shown him immense favor, who was perhaps his biological father, and certainly his mother's devoted lover. On the other hand, the republic he believed Caesar was destroying. The choice for Brutus was between personal loyalty and political principle, and he chose the latter, or at least believed he did. His involvement lent moral weight to the conspiracy in the eyes of many Romans, as Brutus was widely regarded as a man of integrity. You can almost feel the tension in that final moment, as Caesar, realizing Brutus was among his attackers, famously expressed his profound shock. This wasn't just a political enemy delivering a final blow. It was a deeply personal wound from someone he had nurtured and trusted. The assassination, therefore, wasn't just an act of regicide. It was an act of personal betrayal, making Caesar's end all the more tragic and emotionally resonant. This complex, tangled relationship between Caesar, Servilia, and Brutus forever cemented the assassination as a family affair. A dramatic interplay of love, loyalty, and the ultimate act of political violence. And with Caesar gone, the task of shaping his legacy fell to his unexpected heir. With Caesar violently removed from the stage, Rome was plunged into a desperate struggle for power, and it was in this chaotic vacuum that his adopted son, the young Octavian, began his remarkable rise. You see, Caesar's death didn't just end his life. It ignited a furious fight over his legacy, and Octavian, originally named Gaius Octavius, was surprisingly adept at seizing control of the narrative, spinning tales and consolidating power in a way that Caesar himself would have admired. It was like a giant chess game, and Octavian, barely 18, somehow became the Grand Master overnight. Caesar had adopted Octavian in his will, making him his legal son and principal heir. This was a hugely significant act, as it immediately thrust Octavian, a relatively unknown and physically frail teenager, onto the center stage of Roman politics. He inherited not only Caesar's vast wealth, but also his immense name and, crucially, the loyalty of many of Caesar's veterans. He quickly understood that his path to power lay in avenging his adoptive father's murder and upholding his memory. Octavian, alongside Mark Antony and Marcus Aemilius Lepidus, formed the Second Triumvirate, an official, legally sanctioned alliance aimed at crushing the conspirators and consolidating their own power. This period was marked by brutal proscriptions, far more widespread than Sulla's, as the triumvirs eliminated their political enemies. It was a ruthless demonstration of power, and Octavian, despite his youth, proved to be as cold and calculating as any veteran politician. In the struggle to control Caesar's legacy, Octavian was a master propagandist. He elevated Caesar to divine status, promoting the cult of the divine Julius. This move not only legitimized his own claim as the son of a god Divi Filius, but also effectively silenced any lingering republican sentiment by associating Caesar with the sacred. He emphasized Caesar's public virtues, his military genius, and his popularity with the common people, while carefully downplaying or outright ignoring the more scandalous aspects of his private life, or framing them in a way that suited his narrative. A quirky tidbit. Octavian also oversaw the completion of many of Caesar's public works projects, further cementing his link to his adoptive father in the public mind. Historians still argue whether Octavian genuinely admired Caesar's political vision, or if he simply used his adoptive father's name and legacy as a stepping stone to his own imperial ambitions. What is clear is that Octavian skillfully manipulated public perception, turning Caesar from a controversial figure into a deified ancestor, a symbol of Rome's new imperial future. He systematically discredited the conspirators, portraying them as misguided murderers, and eliminated his rivals, including Antony, who, remember, had his own scandalous affair with Cleopatra, making him an easy target for Octavian's moralizing propaganda. You see, Octavian understood that controlling Caesar's memory was key to controlling Rome's future. He carefully crafted a narrative of Caesar as the benevolent, divinely chosen ruler, effectively erasing or reinterpreting the shocking truth of his countless lovers and personal excesses. This strategic shaping of Caesar's legacy allowed Octavian to transition Rome from a republic to an empire, with himself as the first emperor, Augustus. It's a testament to the power of narrative control, ensuring that even after death, Caesar continued to shape the course of Roman history, albeit through the lens of his carefully managed heir. As we delve into the sensational claims about Caesar's countless lovers and his infamous reputation, it's absolutely critical to understand the nature of our historical sources. They are often biased, frequently exaggerated, and rarely offer the kind of objective, unbiased reporting we might expect today. You see, writing history in ancient Rome wasn't just about recording facts. It was often a deeply political act, aimed at promoting certain figures, discrediting rivals, or justifying specific political outcomes. It's like trying to get the truth from a reality TV show, where everyone has an agenda and the cameras are always rolling. Our primary sources for Caesar's life, including his private affairs, come from various Roman writers who lived during or shortly after his time. Figures like Suetonius and Plutarch, who wrote biographies of Caesar, are invaluable, but they often relied on earlier accounts, rumors, and personal anecdotes that might have been distorted over time. For instance, Suetonius in his The 12 Caesars delights in recounting salacious details, often without rigorous verification. He's the ancient world's equivalent of a gossip columnist, and while entertaining, his claims always require a healthy dose of skepticism. Think about the context. Caesar had numerous enemies and rivals who would have seized on any rumor, however flimsy, to tarnish his reputation. Cicero, as we discussed, was a master of rhetorical attack, and he certainly didn't hesitate to deploy personal insults and scandalous accusations against Caesar. Catullus, the poet, had his own reasons for disdain, and his verses were notoriously explicit and personal. These individuals were not objective reporters. They were participants in the brutal Roman political game, and their writings reflected their biases. A quirky tidbit. Some historians argue that the very existence of so many scandalous anecdotes about Caesar, even those lacking concrete proof, speaks to his larger-than-life personality and his willingness to defy convention, making him an easy target for both genuine criticism and inventive slander. Historians still argue about the extent to which these sources accurately reflect Caesar's private life versus merely serving as political propaganda. For example, the accusations about Nicomedes of Bithynia were almost certainly exaggerated for political purposes, aiming to shame Caesar. Even the accounts of his relationships with Servilia and Cleopatra, while generally accepted as factual, are often presented with a sensationalist flair that might obscure the true nature of the connections. You see, The Roman elite loved a good scandal, and writers were happy to supply it. The challenge then for modern historians is to sift through this mountain of biased information, looking for corroborating evidence, understanding the motivations of the ancient authors, and ultimately trying to piece together a plausible picture of Caesar's life. We can't simply take everything at face value. The shocking truth about his countless lovers, therefore, is not a simple fact. It's a mosaic built from fragments of evidence, seasoned with a liberal dose of rumor, and viewed through the often distorted lens of ancient Roman political and social agendas. It's a reminder that history is never just a list of facts. It's an interpretation, a story told by those who survived. And sometimes, those who had an axe to grind. This leads us to consider the Roman approach to morality itself. Understanding Caesar's secret sex life requires a deep dive into the fascinating, often contradictory world of Roman morality. Public versus private. Well, you see, ancient Rome was a society deeply concerned with appearances, with the outward display of virtue and adherence to tradition. Publicly, Romans championed stoicism, gravitas, dignity, and pietous duty to family, state, and gods. Why, they spoke of the sanctity of marriage and the importance of female chastity. But privately, especially within the elite circles, the reality often bore little resemblance to the ideal. It was like a meticulously crafted social media profile, hiding a much messier, more complicated life behind the scenes. For Roman men, particularly those of the upper class, there was a significant double standard. While they were expected to be masters of their households and uphold public decorum, their extramarital activities were often tolerated, even quietly admired, as long as they didn't involve Roman wives of high standing, which was seen as infringing on another man's property rights or led to excessive public scandal. A man who frequented prostitutes, took a slave as a concubine, or engaged in same-sex relations as long as he was the active, dominant partner, generally faced little social censure. It was a measure of his virility and power. A quirky tidbit: Roman satirists often joked about husbands who were outwardly moral but privately indulged in all sorts of excesses, highlighting this pervasive hypocrisy. For Roman women, however, the rules were far more stringent. Chastity, fidelity, and obedience were paramount. A married woman's infidelity could lead to severe social ostracism, divorce, and even legal penalties. They were expected to be confined to the domestic sphere, focused on managing the household and raising children. Cleopatra's very presence in Rome, as Caesar's acknowledged lover and mother of his alleged son, was a direct affront to these gendered moral norms, which is why she caused such intense discomfort among the conservative Roman elite. Historians still argue whether this societal hypocrisy contributed to the eventual decline of the Roman Republic, as the moral fabric seemed to fray under the weight of powerful individuals flouting traditional rules. What is clear is that Caesar, more than almost anyone, exploited and embodied this gap between public morality and private conduct. He was a master of projecting an image of power and control, even while his private life was a whirlwind of affairs that would have ruined a lesser man. His ability to navigate, and indeed leverage, these double standards speaks volumes about his unique position and political acumen. You can sense the tension in Rome, the polite nods in the forum, while hushed whispers about Caesar's latest conquest circulated behind closed doors. This disconnect between public virtue and private indulgence created a fertile ground for gossip, slander, and political maneuvering. Caesar, with his boundless appetites and his unparalleled power, pushed these boundaries further than any Roman before him, making his personal life a constant source of fascination and controversy. He was a living testament to the fact that for the Roman elite, morality was often a matter of convenience and appearance, rather than a deeply held principle. And as you'll see, this complicated moral landscape extended even to the question of his potential children. The fascinating and often scandalous story of Caesar's love life leads us to another critical aspect of his legacy: the question of Caesar's heirs. You see, in Roman society, lineage was paramount, particularly for powerful men. Producing legitimate children was not just a personal desire. It was a political necessity, ensuring the continuation of one's family, name, wealth, and influence. For a man like Caesar, who ascended to unparalleled power, the matter of his offspring was of supreme political importance, far beyond simple paternity. It's like a corporate CEO needing to ensure their legacy continues, but with more toga parties and potential civil wars. Caesar had one legitimate child, his daughter Julia, from his first wife Cornelia. As we discussed, her marriage to Pompey the Great was a crucial political alliance, and her tragic death severed a vital personal link in the triumvirate. Her passing meant that Caesar, for all his conquests, had no legitimate male heir from his own bloodline to inherit his immense power and standing. This absence was a significant factor in his later decision to adopt Octavian. Then, of course, there was Caesarion, his son with Cleopatra. While Cleopatra passionately claimed him as Caesar's biological son, and historical evidence largely supports this, Caesar never officially acknowledged him as his legitimate heir in Rome. Roman law did not recognize children born outside a legal Roman marriage as legitimate, and to do so would have been a profound defiance of Roman custom, further fueling fears of his monarchical intentions. A quirky tidbit: despite not officially acknowledging Caesarion, Caesar allowed Cleopatra to name their son Caesarion, and he reportedly displayed a golden statue of Cleopatra and Caesarion in a temple in Rome, a clear public statement of their Rome bond. Even if not a legal declaration of paternity, historians still argue whether Caesar would have eventually acknowledged Caesarion as his heir if he had lived longer and consolidated his power more fully, or if he genuinely intended Octavian to be his sole successor. Beyond Julia and Caesarion, ancient sources also whisper about other potential children. Some accounts, less substantiated but persistent, suggest that Caesar may have fathered children with other Roman women, or even foreign paramours during his extensive campaigns. These claims are largely unverified and often dismissed as mere rumor or propaganda, but they contribute to the overall image of Caesar as a man of boundless appetites and prolific romantic activity. You can almost imagine the hushed conversations among Roman senators. He conquers Gaul, but does he also conquer every eligible woman he meets? The question of Caesar's heirs was ultimately resolved not by blood, but by adoption. His choice of Octavian, his grandnephew, as his adopted son and principal heir was a calculated political move that ensured the continuation of his name and legacy, even if not his direct bloodline. This decision, however, came at the expense of Caesarion, who was eventually executed by Octavian to remove any potential rival to his claim as Caesar's sole legitimate successor. The saga of Caesar's heirs underscores the profound intertwining of personal life and political power in ancient Rome. It highlights how even the most intimate aspects of a man's life, his relationships and his children, were inextricably linked to the fate of the Republic, and ultimately the birth of the empire. Caesar's legacy, both personal and political, lived on, even if the path to its continuation was paved with complex choices and tragic ends. The story of Julius Caesar, with its dazzling military victories, audacious political maneuvers, and notoriously scandalous love life, has solidified his place as an enduring myth, lover, and conqueror. You see, unlike many historical figures whose private lives fade into obscurity, Caesar's romantic entanglements are not mere footnotes. They are central to his legend, shaping how we perceive him across millennia. He's not just the general who conquered Gaul. He's also the man who charmed Cleopatra, defied Sulla, and seemed to bend every societal rule. It's like he was designed by a storyteller, a character too compelling to be confined to mere historical facts. His reputation as a prolific lover, a bold adulterer, as his enemies called him, has contributed significantly to his larger-than-life image. It suggests a man of boundless energy and formidable appetites, not just for power and military glory, but for life itself. This aspect of his persona makes him more relatable, more human, even as his accomplishments seem almost superhuman. It shows a man who lived with an intensity that few could match, both on the battlefield and in the bedroom. A quirky tidbit. Even Shakespeare, centuries later, chose to highlight Caesar's romantic side, particularly his relationship with Cleopatra, in his plays, ensuring that this aspect of his life remained etched in the popular imagination. This blend of ruthless ambition and personal magnetism has made him a compelling figure for countless generations. He embodies the paradox of a man who was both a genius and a rule breaker, a statesman and a notorious philanderer. His affairs, especially the one with Cleopatra, are not just historical curiosities. They are iconic love stories, imbued with drama, power, and tragic ends. They highlight the intricate dance between personal desire and political necessity that defined his life. Historians still argue about the true nature of his relationships. Were they genuine love affairs, purely political alliances, or a combination of both? The ambiguity only adds to the allure of the myth. You can almost picture the endless retellings of his life, from ancient biographers to modern films, all grappling with this dual nature of Caesar, the unyielding conqueror and the irresistible lover. His sexual history, rather than detracting from his achievements, often enhances them, suggesting a man of such potent vitality that no sphere of life could contain his energies. It's a testament to the fact that scandal, when attached to a figure of immense power, can often contribute to their legendary status, rather than diminish it. The enduring myth of Caesar, therefore, is inextricably linked to his reputation as a great lover. It adds a layer of human drama, passion, and sometimes outright scandal to his otherwise monumental public career. It ensures that he remains a figure of endless fascination, a man whose private life continues to intrigue and provoke discussion long after the dust of his battles has settled. He remains the ultimate example of a man who conquered the world, and apparently many hearts along the way. And as you'll see, these two aspects of his life were rarely separate. The fascinating dichotomy of Julius Caesar as both a master strategist and a legendary lover wasn't a coincidence. It reveals a profound connection between his personal daring and his immense military ambition. You see, for Caesar, the bedroom and the battlefield were often two sides of the same coin, governed by similar principles of risk-taking, strategic maneuvering, and the audacious pursuit of conquest. It was almost as if his romantic boldness was a training ground for his military genius, or vice versa. You'd think a man would specialize, but Caesar was clearly a multitasker. Consider his temperament. Caesar was a man who embraced risk, who delighted in pushing boundaries, and who possessed an almost superhuman confidence in his own abilities. This trait was evident in his audacious military campaigns, from his lightning-fast movements in Gaul to his daring crossing of the Rubicon. He was willing to gamble everything on a single, decisive move. This same audacity is reflected in his romantic life. He pursued married women of high status, Servilia, Mucia, openly flouted Roman social norms with Cleopatra, and seemed utterly unfazed by the gossip and slander that followed him. It was the same all-or-nothing attitude, just applied to different spheres of conquest. His charm, too, was a potent weapon in both arenas. On the battlefield, his charisma rallied his troops, inspiring fierce loyalty and unwavering dedication. In the bedroom, that same charisma allowed him to captivate and influence a wide array of powerful women. He understood human nature, whether it was the psychology of a frightened enemy or the desires of a potential lover. A quirky tidbit: ancient authors often describe Caesar as having an almost hypnotic effect on people, a quality that served him equally well in winning over legions and winning over hearts. Historians still argue whether his personal daring was a byproduct of his military success, or if his innate audacious personality simply expressed itself in both war and love. You see, for Caesar, every interaction was a negotiation, every relationship a potential alliance, every challenge an opportunity for victory. The art of seduction, whether of a woman or an entire province, required similar skills, understanding desires, exploiting weaknesses, demonstrating strength, and, ultimately, asserting dominance. His ability to charm and persuade, to make people want to be on his side or in his bed, was an integral part of his overall strategy for life. He conquered territory not just with swords, but also with wit and undeniable personal appeal. The intertwined nature of his personal and public lives is a testament to the kind of man Caesar was, one of immense appetites, boundless energy, and an unshakable belief in his own destiny. He lived life with a maximalist approach, leaving no stone unturned, no conquest unattempted, whether it was military or romantic. The scandal and daring of his private life, far from being separate from his military achievements, were often reflections of the same audacious spirit that made him the greatest conqueror of his age. It suggests that the same force that drove him to expand Rome's borders also drove him to expand his own personal boundaries, leaving a trail of both triumphs and scandalous whispers in his wake. As the flickering oil lamps dim and the whispers of ancient Rome begin to fade, we arrive at the final reckoning, Caesar's true legacy. You see, after journeying through his audacious youth, his strategic marriages, his passionate affairs with powerful women like Servilia and Cleopatra, and the persistent rumors of countless others, you now understand that Caesar was a man whose private life was as monumental and impactful as his public career. His story is not just about battles and politics. It's about the intricate, often scandalous dance between personal desire and imperial ambition. His countless lovers, whether confirmed historical figures or the product of Roman gossip, undeniably shape our understanding of the man. They paint a picture of a figure driven by immense appetites, a profound charisma, and an almost defiant disregard for convention. This aspect of his life, often deemed scandalous by his contemporaries, paradoxically contributes to his enduring fascination. It makes him relatable, a complex human being rather than a mere historical statue. It reminds us that even the most powerful individuals are still governed by human desires and vulnerabilities. Consider for a moment how his personal life influenced the very trajectory of Roman history. His defiance of Sulla for Cornelia, the political marriages that solidified the triumvirate, his profound love for Julia, whose death contributed to the civil war, his passionate, politically charged affair with Cleopatra, which secured Egypt for Rome but also fueled fears of his monarchical ambitions, and even the whispers about Nicomedes used as a weapon by his enemies. Every major relationship, every romantic entanglement, seems to have been woven into the fabric of his rise and, ultimately, his fall. Historians still argue about the precise weight of his personal life versus his political acumen in his ultimate fate. But what is clear is that they were inextricably linked. So, when you think of Julius Caesar, don't just picture the stoic general crossing the Rubicon or the brilliant orator in the Forum. Remember the bald adulterer, the man whose charisma extended far beyond the battlefield, whose appetites were as boundless as his ambition. Remember the whispers, the jokes, the scandals that followed him like a shadow, shaping his legend even as they sought to diminish it. His secret sex life, as we've explored, wasn't just a footnote. It was a central defining characteristic, a testament to a man who lived life on his own terms, leaving no aspect unexplored. He was a conqueror of lands, yes, but also a conqueror of hearts, a rule breaker in both war and love. His legacy is one of unparalleled achievement, intertwined with a personal life that defied expectations and continues to intrigue us today. He was Caesar, and his life, both public and private, was nothing short of legendary. The echoes of Rome are fading now, the sounds of chariot wheels and senatorial debates growing distant. The flickering oil lamps have almost burned out, and the ancient city is slipping back into slumber. You can close your eyes, let the soft hum of the fan lull you into a peaceful quiet. The emperors and queens, the scandals and triumphs, they're all just whispers now, fading into the comfortable darkness. Rest easy, knowing that even the most powerful figures in history were, in their own way, just as complicated and contradictory as you and me.